Chapter 17 of The Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Richard Shipp. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. The Cradle of a Locomotive. In England, it is usual for each important railway to have its own locomotive factory, to which is often added a series of workshops for the construction of carriages, trucks, and the 101 appliances which are commonly used in the maintenance of a line and its rolling stock. At Swindon, Crewe, Derby, Doncaster, Gateshead, Cowlairs, Ashford, Nine Elms, Horwich, we find thousands of men busily engaged on the conversion of metal into those engines of which the Englishman is so proud on account of their shapeliness, finish, and durability. A visit to one of these great factories is indeed an important day in the visitor's life and a noteworthy addition to his general education, especially if he be a person hitherto unacquainted with the antecedents of the steam horse that carries him so swiftly about the country. His interest is at once aroused, even before he enters the roar of the shops, by learning how quickly they have converted acres of green fields into the scene where so many hundreds of skilled workmen earn their daily bread. Take, for example, the case of Crewe. In 1841, a village of 203 inhabitants. The locomotive works were established 2 years later. In 1851, the population had risen to 4,571, and ever since it has increased by leaps and bounds, keeping pace with the extension of the factories till at the present day no less than 35,000 people are gathered round the great engineering establishment which employs upwards of 7,000 hands and covers a quarter of a square mile. Or again, turn to Swindon on the Great Western and its increase from 2,459 to 45,000 souls in half a century. Or to Stratford, where the works are the focus of a small town. In fact, the same story can be told of all the places mentioned above as the headquarters of a railway's creative department. On entering the works, the stranger is almost appalled by the noise and motion that at once envelops him. Standing about, tended by little gangs of men, are strange machines of which he had never dreamed, and others of which he has read, maybe, but seen only in their photographic presentments. As he passes from shop to shop, he sees sights that will impress themselves on his memory for many a long year to come. Though they succeed one another so fast that only after the lapse of a little time, when he has had a chance to rally his overtaxed brain, can he clearly separate them. In addition to his admiration for the individual processes by which metal is tortured, battered, pinched, trimmed and shaped, he will be left with a general increase of respect for the men who designed and the men who operate the many forms of machinery employed by the locomotive builder. In order to economize time and labour, a railway works is subdivided into several departments, each having its separate building and being connected by rails to the rest. There is the casting shop with its huge crucibles and queer-looking moulds which convert molten metal into the rough likeness of wheels, cylinders and other objects too numerous to mention. The forging shop, where huge steam hammers pound away at a mass of white-hot steel until it has been broadened or lengthened into a shape at which the spectator could hardly have guessed when the ingot left the furnace. The rolling shop, which flattens out glowing lumps into thin plates of steel or iron as easily as your cook expands a pound of pastry into a pie crust, and huge scissors trim the plates like so much paper, or cut lengths off a thick steel bar as if it were soft German sausage. Before you have fully recovered from this heroic handling of metal by metal, you are in the clangour of the boiler shop, where all the demons of noise appear to be rioting madly together, and you soon trace the uproar to dozens of hammers smiting the heads of red-hot rivets. Your guide smiles and points to the hydraulic riveter, which, in a quiet manner that contrasts with the din around, is closing up rivets at the bidding of a man who works a small lever. On all sides stand boilers in various stages of completion, some only a mere beginning, others externally complete but minus the hundreds of tubes that will soon fill their strong stomachs. Others ready for transportation to the construction shop, where they will first make the acquaintance of the other weighty portions that are items in the sum of a finished locomotive. To the layman, the turning shop is perhaps the most interesting because it contains a number of extraordinary tools beautifully adapted to the work they have to perform. Our illustrations include 2 views of this department of the Horwich Locomotive Works, where the rolling stock of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway is made. The one shows a pair of 7-foot driving wheels being turned on a large lathe after the rims have been driven on the wheel centres, which in turn have been forced by hydraulic presses onto their axle. On the right-hand side are seen 2 pairs still tireless. The facing plates of the lathe slowly revolve, carrying the wheels with them, while a tool is fed up to its work by an attendant and moved horizontally by an ingenious automatic arrangement of cogs and worm gear. At every revolution, the wheel has a part of its diameter removed, perhaps only 1/100th of an inch, until the whole tread has been reduced by the adamantine tool to perfect circularity and smoothness. In other parts of the shop, cylinders are being bored out, and all their flat surfaces scraped perfectly true by steam planes, which travel to and fro with monotonous regularity. Here, crank pins receive their proper shape. There, a connecting rod is having its ends, pinholes, and bosses trued, for the uttermost exactness is a leading feature of every part of a locomotive. You will probably stop a few minutes to watch the operation of a turret head machine as it bores the inside of a cylinder and simultaneously shapes the outside too, and the capstan lathe, which bristles with curious tools, any one of which the man in charge can bring into action by a single movement. In the erecting shop, the products of the forgers, the boiler makers, the turners, the planers, and the finishers are all brought together. Up and down the bays of the great shed run overhead travelling cranes, which toy even with the weight of an entire locomotive. Could you but stay and watch for a few days, you would see how the frames are set up, the cylinders attached, the boiler lowered into position, fixed, lagged, and connected to the many steam and water pipes that enter it. The wheels rolled under the frame, the multitudinous rods slipped onto their pins, the funnel set up, the cab filled with its fittings, and the whole combination tested before it is forwarded to the painting shop to receive its shining coat of green or blue or chocolate, relieved with neat lines and shown up to advantage by surfaces of glistening black. Even when your eyes have had their fill of locomotives, there still remain the wagon and carriage shops and all their wonderful woodworking machinery, and the sawmills and the pattern maker's shop, and the powerhouse, and the offices where delicate tracings are made of every design used on the premises. You can no more get to the bottom of such works as those at Swindon or Crewe in a single day's walk round than you can do justice to the Royal Academy's pictures in a half-hour's scamper through the galleries. From generalisations we will descend to particulars and focus our attention on an engineering establishment which is not so well known in England as the works already mentioned, although it holds first place in the world as a factory of locomotives as measured by its output. The Baldwin Locomotive Works, Philadelphia, supply not only most of the large railway systems of the United States, but also Russia, Japan, Africa, South America, and to a smaller extent France, India, and England, with engines built to suit the requirements of any designer. They are in truth a factory from which completed engines are turned out at the rate of over 6 for each working day. The greatest output was reached in 1903, where 2,022 were built, exclusive of extra repair parts equal to another 250 locomotives. The works employ 15,800 men who work 10 hours a day, shift relieving shift, so that Sundays excepted, there is no cessation whatever. The buildings, which number 39, cover 17 acres and have 37 acres of floor space. 11,000 horsepower is absorbed by the machinery, representing a yearly coal consumption of 100,000 tonnes. The first locomotive turned out by the firm was put together by one Matthias Baldwin in 1832. Baldwin, a jeweller by trade, received that year an order to build a model locomotive for the Philadelphia Museum. His work was so successful that he then was asked to construct a full-sized machine for the Philadelphia, Germanstown and Norristown Railroad Company, whose short line of 6 miles was operated by horsepower. The Old Ironsides, as this was called, is the American counterpart of the English rocket. It was 4-wheeled and had 54-inch drivers, cylinders 9.5 by 18 inches, and a wooden frame. The boiler contained 73 copper tubes, each 7 feet long. Great difficulty was encountered owing to the lack of proper tools. For boring the cylinders, a chisel fixed in a block of wood and turned by hand had to suffice. The wheels were made with wooden spokes, wrought iron tyres and cast iron hubs. Blacksmiths able to weld a bar of iron exceeding 1¼ inches in thickness were not to be found. Mr. Baldwin had to do much of the work with his own hands and to educate the workmen who assisted him, besides improvising tools for the various processes. Yet, in spite of all these difficulties, the Old Ironsides were completed in 10 months, and with its usual train of passenger coaches attached, attained a speed of 30 miles an hour. The new machine was regarded rather as a curiosity and a bait to allure travel than as a practical everyday servant. So great were the wonder and curiosity which attached to such a prodigy that people flocked to see the marvel and eagerly bought the privilege of riding after the strange monster. After this, Mr. Baldwin went into regular business as a locomotive builder and started an undertaking which has gradually swelled to its present colossal size. In February 1902, the 20,000th finished engine, a compound 10-wheeled, left the works. Let us now follow an American locomotive through the course of its construction, which is conveniently divided into 4 divisions: the making of the boiler, the making of the cylinders, the making of the wheel frames, and the final assembling or erecting. For the guidance of the English reader, it should be remarked that on American engines, the flat, spacious bed plate or platform of the British locomotives, to which the cylinders are secured, is replaced by a comparatively light frame, the cylinders and their massive saddles being fixed to the boiler direct and designed to act as a base for other attachments, such as the cowcatcher. The boiler. In modern American boilers, steel is used throughout, except when designed for export, in which case the firebox is often of copper. The steel is received at the works in sheets of various sizes and thicknesses from the manufacturers who make a specialty of plate rolling. In America, specialization has gone so far that no locomotive factory attempts to manufacture all its material, finding it cheaper to get a large part of it ready prepared. Some of the steel sheets are 20 feet long and from 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch thick. They are moved about the workshops by means of overhead travelling cranes, which are the more easily worked on account of the absence of belting in shops where electric motors operate most of the tools. The plates are first to be prepared for punching and drilling. They are laid on a table and the centres marked from standard gauges. If a flanged edge is required, the holes are not marked until the flange has been formed. When the centres have been determined, the sheet is introduced to an electrically driven punch. Above the machine is a crane from which the plate is suspended by means of chains. The punch has a projection on its underside, and as soon as this projection catches in a centre mark, the punch is started and soon bites out a clean round hole. Flanging, i.e. turning up the edge of, a plate, is done on hydraulic presses, which exert a force of 365 tons. The plate is heated in a large furnace and placed on a suitable form, clamped firmly to the table on the end of the ram. This rises and forces the plate into a mould, which turns the edges over to the shape of the form. Tube sheets, dome rings, and many other parts can be thus fashioned much more rapidly and accurately than is possible in handwork. The plates are now sent back to the boiler shop for assembling. Their edges are planed off by special machines. The Plates for the boiler barrel, the circular portion, are fed into a bending machine which consists of 3 rolls turned by electricity. The 2 lower rolls are on the same plane, but the third is adjustable as to its height, its position being controlled by large screws, one at each end. By altering its position, the plate can be bent to any required radius. We will suppose that all the plates are flanged, bent and drilled. They have now to be put together by the agency of hydraulic power. The machine used for riveting has a horseshoe shape, the 2 horns being parallel and close together. At their extremities on the inside, they carry dies, the one fixed, the other moved by tremendous water pressure. The boiler barrel, roughly bolted together, is raised end up and lowered with the plates between the 2 jaws of the riveter, which quietly closes the rivets in succession. A 25-ton travelling crane now hoists the several parts of the boiler to the upper floor of the shop, where the rear half is placed upside down and the inner shell of the firebox is fixed in position by means of nuts and bolts. For some portions, hand riveting is necessary, as an hydraulic riveter cannot be introduced into very confined spaces. The firebox being finished, the boiler is turned up again and the steam dome assembled and secured, and all seams are caulked at the joints, with the tool having a rounded edge after the forward end plate has been fixed. The workmen now add the smoke box extension, which is joined to the front boiler ring by an external ring to give a smooth finish on the outside. We will leave the boiler to be conveyed to the erecting shop while we visit another section of the works where the cylinders are being made. For these, cast iron is always used. In the foundry are 3 couplers or crucibles having each a capacity of 50 tons. The coupler is a stack built of metal plates lined with firebrick to withstand the terrific heat. Trucks of pig iron and scrap iron are hoisted up to the mouth, into which the materials are shot on the top of a thick bed of coke. Then more coke is put in, and another layer of metal, and the process is repeated until the coupler is full to the proper level. An air blast produced by a large blower is now forced into the coupler through 2 openings about 5 feet from the bottom, and very soon the metal has all been reduced to a liquid form fit for casting. The tap is a small opening closed by a clay plug and discharging into a spout from which the metal runs into ladles. The moulders have meanwhile prepared the cylinder moulds, which are filled from a smaller ladle in 2 goes, as a schoolboy would say. When the pouring is finished, the moulds are allowed to stand about 12 hours before the casting is removed, and after removal the latter remains untouched for a day longer. Then the outside is cleaned, and all jagged projections are chopped off preparatory to forwarding the casting to the turning shop. The engine we have under consideration is a compound, and the steam is admitted to the cylinders through piston valves, so that each casting has 3 circular passages with parallel axes to be bored out. First of all, the end surfaces are well planed down and the whole is placed on a table so that the final outline of all the passages may be scribed on the ends. Then it is ready for the boring machine, which clears out the 2 cylinders and the steam chest simultaneously with 3 boring bars, which are adjustable so as to fit cylinders of different sizes. The bars can be rotated independently by toothed clutches. Each has a slot running almost its entire length, and in the centre of the bar is located a screw revolved by means of separate gearing. The tools are carried on collars which slip over the bars and have pieces projecting inwards through the slots and taking hold of the screws, so that as the latter rotate, the tools are gradually shifted along the bars. Before placing the cylinder on the machine, the workmen so adjust the bars that their centres are exactly the distance apart of the centres of the finished cylinders. The bed to carry the casting is slid along, leaving the bars unsupported at their outer ends. The casting is then placed on the bed and fixed in position, after which the bed slides back into place for the final adjustment of the bars to their true centre lines. As they come from the foundry, the cylinders are about 3/4 of an inch less in diameter than they are to be when the boring process has been completed. To remove this surplusage, the tools must be sent through them 3 or 4 times, a sharp lookout being maintained to see that the clearing is not carried too far. The cylinder ends are now clamped in place and holes are drilled through the cylinder flanges to match those already in the ends. A steel bush or lining is next driven into the steam chest with the proper apertures for the steam already cut. The piston valve gradually wears this lining away and it can easily be replaced. This process finished and all flat surfaces carefully planed down, the cylinder is forwarded to the erecting shop. Wheels, etc. At the Baldwin Works, cast steel is used for driving wheel centres on fast passenger engines. The centre includes the hub, spokes and inner part of the tyre, and cast iron or cast steel for freight work. All steel castings are purchased from other firms. The first operation is to prepare the wheels for forcing them on the axles. They are laid down on special machines with rotating tables, and the hubs are faced and then bored out to size with great accuracy. A keyway is slotted in each hub. The axles, of hammered steel, are in the meantime turned and finished in lathes, the accuracy of their measurements being constantly proved by delicate gauges. Then a keyway to match that in the wheel centres is cut at each end of the axle, the one being at right angles to the other on the circumference. In order to ensure a tight fit, the hub is drilled out to a diameter less by 3/1000th of an inch per inch than that of the axle end. The axle is now hung between the uprights of a hydraulic press and one of the wheels set up in front of it, the two being so placed that the keyways exactly match. A man smears the end of the axle and the interior of the hub with a mixture of black lead and oil to act as a lubricant. Then the space between the other end of the axle and the ram is filled up with metal blocks and pressure applied at the rate of 10 tons to every inch of axle diameter. After one wheel is on, the axle is reversed and the other wheel attached in like manner. Finally, wedges are driven into the keyways to prevent any movement of the wheel round its axle. The lathe now comes into use again. The axle is mounted on the centres and the wheels have their rims turned perfectly true to gauge, in readiness for the tyres, which when expanded by heat will just slip over the rims. As they cool, they bind themselves on with enormous force. All crank pins are next turned and hydraulically forced into their holes. The connecting rods are finished off and all their frictional surfaces lined with steel bushings. The frames have been forged, planed and drilled by most ingenious machinery. The springs have been built up of cast steel laminae. The steam dome cover has been beaten out of a ductile iron plate. The tender tanks are ready, also the trucks for the smaller wheels. And all brass fittings and the air brake apparatus are complete. So we can follow them to the last scene, which is enacted in the erecting shop. This, at the Baldwin Locomotive Works, is 160 feet wide by 337 feet long, the area being divided by rows of columns into 3 bays, each spanned by 2 Sellers electric travelling cranes of 50 and 100 tons capacity respectively. Sometimes the boiler is first set up, sometimes the frames. In this particular case, we will suppose that the former has the precedence. The boiler, then, we picture as supported on strong jacks fore and aft. Men now scrape the upper circular surfaces of the cylinder saddles to a true fit against the underside of the smoke box. The cylinders are then bolted on. In the meantime, the tube fitters have been busily inserting the many iron tubes for which holes had already been made in the firebox and forward end plates. These are reamed out until the tube passes easily through them. At the smoke box end, a copper ferrule is slipped over the tube so that when the latter is expanded, it may have a semi-elastic cushion between it and the tube sheet and form an absolutely watertight joint. The expanding tool is applied on both sides of the sheet, bulging out the tube so that it cannot be forced either way. Here comes a crane with the frames, which are described as the backbone of an engine. They must be fixed on a dead true line, and to effect this, a string is run from the centre of the low-pressure cylinder exactly through its axis and secured to a standard placed beside the rear end of the frame. A heavy crossplate or yoke is now bolted to the boiler and to the frames to hold them rigid and also form a seat for the bars which guide the piston rods. The next step is to get the driving wheels in place. They are standing ready on a vacant track near their engine, properly spaced. A crane picks up the boiler and all its attachments, swings it over the wheels, and slowly lowers it so that the journals in the frame settle truly down onto the axles. Assuming that the boiler fittings are all fixed, the water test can be applied. The blow-off cock is connected to a high-pressure hydraulic main, and water forced in until the gauge shows a stress 1/3 greater than will be used in actual running. Men dodge about with their caulking tools, and wherever there is a sign of leakage, they hammer at the seam until it is perfectly tight. The boiler is now emptied for the steam test, 220 pounds per square inch, which is applied to the steam passages and cylinders as well. These tests are very carefully carried out in order to prove that the boiler and all its fittings are perfectly sound before the engine leaves the shop. Preparations follow to run the engine before setting it down on the rails. The wheels are all lined up, that is, adjusted to exactly the position they should occupy with reference to the centre lines of the cylinders. The connecting rods are set, the link reversing gear assembled, and the valves set to show the amount of lead required, and the eccentrics are keyed to the main axle. Simultaneously, the laggers encircle the boiler and the back of the furnace with slabs of magnesia to enable the boiler to retain its heat better and wrap the jacket in an outer cover of sheet iron. When everything is ready, the boiler is connected to a stationary steam plant and filled with steam at about 100 pounds pressure. The engine is then given 3 running tests, 2 in forward, 1 in backward gear. This completes the shop tests. It's not necessary to describe how the handrails, cab fittings, running boards, and the many smaller details of the locomotive are assembled, or how the swivelling truck and wheels are placed in position forward of the cylinder. Not much time is wasted over painting, as in modern American locomotive construction, utility always holds first place. The railway companies employ their engines just so long as they do their duties efficiently, and then send them to the scrap heap to make way for something better. The process, which has been here very rapidly sketched, occupies, on the average, from 2 to 3 months. The shortest record at the Baldwin Works stands at 8 days for a narrow gauge locomotive, casting, boring, erecting and testing all included. The erection occupies but a small fraction of the total time, 5 or 6 days after the boiler is set up, till the engine is fit to go into active service. In England, some sensational performances have been witnessed in the erecting shops, and by the courtesy of the proprietors of engineering, these will be noticed at some length as interesting examples of what a well-drilled body of mechanics can do at a pinch. In February 1888, one of the London and North Western Standard 6-coupled goods engines was erected at Crewe in 25½ working hours, the engine on its completion running a trial trip and being then taken to the paint shop for final painting. 3 years later, this feat was completely eclipsed at the Great Eastern Works, Stratford, where a goods locomotive of the 6-coupled type and its tender was put together in less than 10 hours. A start was made at 9:08 a.m. on December 10th, the frame plates being laid flat on the ground with the horn blocks and spring brackets fixed to them, but otherwise free of attachments, the work having been prepared in the same way as usual for the erectors. At 11 minutes from the start, the first rivet was put into the frame. At 20 minutes, the footplate casting was fixed, and at 26 minutes, the motion plate was in place. The setting and fixing of the cylinders occupied from 27 minutes to 1 hour 17 minutes from the start, while at 2 hours 37 minutes the setting of the motion was commenced and occupied until 3 hours 52 minutes when the men left off for their dinner hour. Soon after recommencing work, namely at 4 hours 7 minutes from the start, the boiler was put in place, having had its mountings fixed and lagging put on prior to being brought to the erecting shop, but being without smoke box or cab. At 5 hours 27 minutes from the start, the engine was wheeled, the wheels having been supplied as they left the wheel shops, and the eccentric sheaves having to be fixed, and the axle boxes and connecting rods and coupling rod brasses having to be fitted by the erectors. At 4:15 p.m, 6 hours 7 minutes from the start, the setting of the valves was commenced, this part of the work being still incomplete when work was stopped for the day at 5:30 p.m. On Friday, work was recommenced at 6 a.m, and by 7 a.m, 8 hours 22 minutes from the start, the valve setting was completed, and 40 minutes later the side rods were on. Prior to this, at 7:15 a.m, painting had been commenced, and by 9:10 a.m, or 9 hours 47 minutes from the start, there having been an interval for breakfast from 8:15 to 9 a.m, the engine was completed and was taken out of the shop to be photographed. During the erection of the engine, the tender had also been in progress, it having been commenced at 9 a.m. on the 10th and finished at 7:40 a.m. on the 11th, the men working the ordinary hours. Later in the day, the engine ran its final trip and was immediately put into regular work. It has since been continuously running with coal trains, weighing about 560 tons gross, between Peterborough and London. In erecting the engine, the number of men employed was 85, made up as follows: fitters, including 3 boys, 39, smiths, 2, boilermakers, rivet boys, etc., 44. On the tender, the numbers were fitters, 16, boilermakers, 16, labourers, 20, making a total of 52. The average time for building an engine and tender is 8 days. It should be added that in this instance the usual number of men employed on an engine was trebled and those on the tender doubled. As an instance of the durability of a well-built engine may be quoted the Charles Dickens, which in the 20 years 1882 to 1902 made 5,000 odd trips between Euston, London and Manchester. During the 2 million miles traversed, the engine did not break down once, and at the end of it all proved as fit for work as ever. The author has to thank Messrs. Burnham, Williams and Company, the present proprietors of the Baldwin Works, for the help they have given him in supplying information for this chapter. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Richard Shipp. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. What the expresses can do. A by no means uncommon type of mathematical problem found in school arithmetics is of the following nature. A train moves at 60 miles an hour, propelled by a driving wheel 7 feet in diameter. How many times per minute does the latter rotate? Or the question may be inverted, and the speed in miles per hour resulting from a certain number of revolutions per second be required. Well, 7 feet being about the standard diameter for English express drivers, how many times a second would they have to turn to produce the mile a minute running? A mile a minute means 88 feet a second, and as the driving wheel covers 22 feet every revolution, it must turn 4 times in that period. So that in the course of 1 minute, the pistons, piston rods, connecting rods and valves have their direction of motion suddenly changed 480 times. This would speedily knock an engine to pieces were the moving parts not very nicely balanced by weights cast or attached between the rim and hub of the driving wheels. As it is, the vibration on the footplates set up by the reciprocation of the machinery is very evident in the best-built locomotive. When talking of express speeds, we generally have 2 things in mind. First, the comparison of new with old records. Secondly, the performances of the best flyers of various countries. Under the first head, it will at first sight appear that we have not made much advance. A reference to old statistics proves, for instance, that as long ago as 1848, a train covered 53¼ miles from London to Didcot in 47 minutes, or at 68 miles an hour, a speed that today is seldom beaten over such a distance. Also that the fast trains of 40 years ago often reeled off their 50 to 55 miles an hour as a regular practice. Then turn to the modern timetable and we find 60 miles an hour heading the list of daily train speeds. Again, comparing the national expresses and noting only the best performances, the reader might easily be led to suppose that the United States stand first for speed, France second, and Great Britain only third. But on a closer examination of details, we soon modify our opinions. There comes in the element of averages. Thus we find that the average speed of all modern English expresses is much higher than it was, that the average weight of the trains hauled is much greater, that the average journey is much longer. And under the second heading, we discover that England's average express speed is much higher than those of America or France. After all, it is not the abnormal that determines the standard. To get down to figures, in 1888 it was found that in the United Kingdom trains ran 62,900 miles per day at 40 or more miles per hour, while only 13,956 miles were covered at such speeds in the United States, and but 9,000 in the whole of Europe. So that, if 40 miles per hour be made the qualifying standard for an express, the British Isles were at that date far ahead of all other countries. Since then, the standard has been considerably raised all round, though Britain is left with a big lead. Individual comparisons are proverbially odious, but often interesting. The fastest regular run in the world is done on the Philadelphia and Reading Railway by the Atlantic Flyers, which cover the 55.5 miles between Camden and Atlantic City in 50 minutes, a speed of 66.6 miles an hour. The Pennsylvania Company also runs an express over a different track between the same places at an average of 64.3 miles. For the next best performances we must go to France, where the 31 miles between Dax and Bayonne are turned off in half an hour dead, and after that we fall back to the 61.7 miles per hour pace attained between Darlington and York on the North Eastern. All three countries can boast several regular services in the immediate neighbourhood of even time, i.e. a mile a minute. So much for mere speed. Now we will consider the fastest long-distance trains of the world. Here France takes the first place with the Paris-Bayonne Express, which covers the 486.25 miles in 8 hours 59 minutes, or 54.13 miles an hour. Second stands the New York-Buffalo 440 miles trip, performed in 8 hours 15 minutes, equaling 53.25 miles per hour. And third comes the 50.77 miles per hour of the Great Northern and the North Eastern East Coast Mail from London to Edinburgh, 393.3 miles. On the count of non-stop runs, England, as is only fair, comes out top. The Great Western now schedules expresses to cover the 246 miles separating London and Plymouth without a single pause. This, like the other journeys mentioned above, is a regular daily performance. On April the 30th, 1904, a train with the mails from the Philadelphia left Plymouth at 6:01 and reached Paddington at 9:55. Including slowing down at Exeter and Bristol, the average rate was just over a mile per minute, and the whole run took a minute less than the previous record when the same company carried the Prince and Princess of Wales in the opposite direction. In America, the best scheduled break is from New York to Troy, 148 miles done in 3 hours dead. And in France, the Nord's 185.5 mile run from Paris to Calais Pier, 3 hours 30 minutes, is the longest. On the whole, Britain stands easily first as a long-distance runner. The timetables of 1903 show no less than 133 of her regular expresses exceeding 100 miles between stops. The London and North Western, 33, the Great Northern, 22, Great Western, 23, and the Midland, 16, taking the lion's share. America can claim about 50 journeys of 100 miles and over performed in daily service, and France some 25. The pickup water trough is used on these long breaks. Anybody who, after upsetting a glass of water on the tablecloth, tries to regain as much as possible of it with a spoon employs the principle of the water scoop, which fills the tanks of a locomotive in motion. A perfectly level stretch of line having been selected, a steel trough is laid centrally between each pair of rails. The trough, 6 inches deep, has a width of about 18 inches and is made up of a number of sections riveted together to give a total length of about 500 yards. Water is admitted to the trough automatically so as to keep it at a depth of 5 inches, the surface being then about 2 inches above the rail. At the end from which a train approaches, an inclined plane leads to the trough, and there is a corresponding plane at the other extremity to lift the scoop out. On approaching a trough, the driver lets down his scoop, the lower or movable part of which contains a watertight hinge. The impact drives the water through this and its connecting pipe into the tender. As soon as the latter is full, the water overflows onto the bank or is returned by a pipe to the trough. Since the raising of the scoop requires a very powerful pull, this operation is often performed by the aid of steam or air pressure on a piston connected by a rod to the scoop itself. For extraordinary speeds, we must turn to the United States, where long, level and straight stretches enable the driver to shake his engine up, as a coachman would say of his horses. Since 1890, the 100 miles per hour figure has been approached and passed on several occasions. Over 4.1 miles, a Philadelphia and Reading Express travelled at 98.4 miles per hour in 1890. 2 years later, a mile was covered in 37 seconds by a New Jersey Central train. But the most sensational performances are credited to the New York Central and Hudson River Railway, which can boast speeds of 102.8, 112.5 and 109.35 miles per hour. The last velocity was maintained in January 1903 for a distance of 7.29 miles. The record for steam locomotion is, however, at present held by a 5-mile run over the plant systems track from Fleming to Jacksonville, which occupied but 2.5 minutes, equal to 120 miles an hour. Some of these phenomenal bursts were the result of competition for the carriage of the mails, and at the time attracted as much interest as the racing of ocean greyhounds. The fastest time on record for a run of over 440 miles falls to the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railways, which sent an express from Chicago to Buffalo, 510 miles, in 8 hours 1 minute, equal to 65.7 miles per hour, exclusive of, and 63.61 miles per hour, inclusive of stops. This was really a most extraordinary performance. The United States are also facile princeps for transcontinental journeys. A mail and newspaper train on the Pennsylvania covers the 1,058 miles between New York and St. Louis in 20 hours, averaging 52.9 miles per hour. On August 4, 1903, the Lowe's Special travelled from New York to Los Angeles, Southern California, 3,246 miles in 73 hours 21 minutes, equal to 44.1 miles per hour. The run from Chicago to Los Angeles, 2,256 miles, was over the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe track. When one considers the rugged nature of the country traversed for hundreds of miles in the neighbourhood of the Rocky Mountains, the speed appears nothing short of marvellous. Canada's best is the exploit of the Japanese mail, when it ran from Vancouver to Brockville, 2,802 miles, in 77 hours 9 minutes, an average of about 36 miles per hour. India is far behind, with a 25 miles per hour average from Bombay to Calcutta. Australia boasts 37 miles per hour for the 576.5 mile trip between Melbourne and Sydney, exclusive of stops. The finest running in Britain has been produced by the rivalry between the West Coast and East Coast routes to Scotland. The race for the North, fought out in 2 campaigns in 1888 and 1895, was confessedly a trial of speed. The two competitors were the Great Northern and the London and North Western, working in combination with the North Eastern and Caledonian railways respectively. And the prime cause of the struggle was the anxiety to secure the August holiday traffic. The Great Northern had, in May 1888, announced that it meant to run third-class passengers to Edinburgh in 9 hours. The North Western in the following month reduced its time to 8.5 hours. The other competitor therefore decided to inaugurate in August an 8-hour service, a challenge which the Euston authorities were quick to take up, fixing 7 3/4 hours as the time to be occupied over the journey. The Great Northern, however, did not mean to be beaten and scored a record of 7 hours 32 minutes. Then a truce was made, and the two rivals, after piling up a few more records, settled down to 7 3/4 hours for the east and 8 hours for the west coast journey. In 1895 they were at it again, but now Aberdeen formed the objective. In June, the best times were 11 hours 35 minutes for the east coast, 523 miles, and 11 hours 50 minutes for the west coast, 540 miles. By August the 22nd, these had been improved upon by 2 hours 57 minutes and 3 hours 10 minutes respectively, the west coast performing the whole distance at an average of 63.3 miles per hour, stoppages included. Does high speed pay? Is a question often asked by the practical man, who is apt to regard these tours de force much in the light of a mere exhibition of the record-making spirit that pervades humanity. This is the answer of Mr. Charles Rouse Martin, an expert on all matters connected with railway performance and practice, as given in the Engineering magazine. Since the accelerations of 1895, usually called the Race to Aberdeen, there has been an enormous expansion of the Anglo-Scottish traffic. For many weeks during July, August and September, the principal expresses, which have been more than doubled in number, have to be sent off day after day in duplicate and even triplicate, and I have known 14 heavy expresses dispatched on a single evening from one London station to Scotland instead of the 4 shown on the timetable. But I may be asked how I know that the acceleration have done this. My answer is that the people who now go and formerly did not have said to me that they had imagined the journey to be far longer and more tiresome than they found it actually to be, and that the truth was brought under their notice by the racing of 1895 and the subsequent acceleration of the regular trains. When they read that trains had reached Aberdeen, Ultima Thule, in their previous ideas, from London in 8 hours 30 minutes by the west coast and 8 hours 40 minutes by the east coast, Perth in 7 1/4 hours, and Edinburgh 6 hours 19 minutes, and all this without the slightest hitch or mishap, they realised that neither the distance nor the journey was so very formidable after all. So they tried it, and having once tried it, they now go to Scotland year by year, and will continue to go. Is there any reason to doubt that the experience of these particular persons who communicated it to me is also that of many others, and that here we have the true explanation of the last quinquennium's traffic development? I think not. High speed is an excellent advertisement. The risks supposed to attending fast travelling are, so far as concerns speed itself, non-existent. On a properly laid track, a train is no more likely to leave the metals when travelling a mile a minute than when doing but 30 miles an hour. And as for collisions, the express is watched over with special care, and if it accidentally charges into a stray truck or fallen tree, that disaster cannot be attributed to its velocity. It may with justice be argued that we have to thank our expresses for the great security which characterises railway travel, since necessity has been the mother of the many wonderful inventions incorporated into signalling and braking apparatus. The value of quick transit is by no means confined to passenger trains. We hear a good deal now of express goods, often worked by passenger locomotives. By getting goods quickly along the line and off it again, a much greater bulk can be handled than with a lower standard of travelling speed. To shift long strings of wagons, more powerful engines are being built from year to year, notably in America and France, where enormous goods trains are hauled at comparatively fast speeds to clear the line for the passenger expresses. So strong is the craving for rapid movement in this bustling age that a good many people prefer waiting for a fast train to taking a local at once, which may get them to their destination at an earlier hour. There is, no doubt, something in the mere fact of swift motion which goes a long way to remove the tedium of a journey, whether of 30 or 300 miles. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of The Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. The Railway in War. When our thoughts turn back to the many stirring events of the Boer War, how often the railway obtrudes itself into them. First, there is the scene at the English station, where the regular, yeoman, or volunteer is bidding farewell to those he loves. A scene of deep sorrow underlying all the cheers and handkerchief waving that accompany the train as it slowly draws out of the platform with its load of troops for the front. At the Cape, the same men are entrained a second time in trucks maybe, and borne for hundreds of miles across the rolling sandy veldt to where they will have a chance of at last coming to hand grips with the enemy. Behind the troops roll up long trains of provisions for man and beast, trains bearing the deadly artillery, trains fitted up with all the appliances of a hospital, trains of horses that will, ere many weeks are out, leave their bones to whiten under the stars. Earlier in the war, we read of trains packed with English fugitives from Pretoria and Johannesburg, strong men and delicate women, all sorely tried by fatigue and heat, hunger and thirst, the taunts of their enemies, and the knowledge that they have left all their worldly possessions behind them to take the chances of war. Then there come down the same line supplies for the Boer army, now advancing on their hardy ponies to meet the English army of Natal. Soon follow in quick succession the battles of Dundee and Landslade, the hurried retreat, the disaster at Nicholson's Neck, and the investment of Ladysmith, from which General French escapes in the last train that left the town. Whichever way we look, or to whatever period of the war, the railway looms large, for it was, in many districts, the sole means of transporting troops and supplies. The very first act of hostility was the derailment by the Boers of a train at Krypan. For months, the sound of dynamite doing its fell work on culverts and railway bridges was heard. Every other day, we read of a train being derailed and burnt, after the mails had been scattered to the winds, and of the exploits of armored trains. At Mafeking, an engine laden with explosives is sent flying along the track towards the besiegers. From Pretoria, the president escapes over the railway to the ship awaiting him at Delagoa Bay. Far up in Rhodesia, men are being painfully transported from Beira to Salisbury along the rickety narrow gauge, and southward to the relief of Mafeking. When the tide turns in favor of England, the engineer gets to work, mending the ruined culverts replacing the shattered bridges, clearing the ruined tunnels. Engines and rolling stock are captured and accompany the advancing army to Bloemfontein and Pretoria, whence they presently return crammed with captured Boers. The British soldier, 1,000 miles from the Cape, was utterly dependent on the steel bars that ran through country inhabited by people who, if they were not openly against us, were certainly not on our side. Again and again, communications were cut by a few pounds of explosive laid cunningly on the track. A hard task indeed fell to the lot of the men who had to watch, organize, and control the railway traffic. There was no class more worried and worked than the railway staff officer. He rose in the small hours of the morning until late at night was engaged in a constant struggle with a host of perplexing problems: the provision of vehicles to transport large bodies of troops, stacks of stores and military equipment, the endeavor to do his duty by a host of superiors, all requiring their own particular needs to be attended to first, the reading and dispatching of cipher telegrams when his head was already dizzy with 2 good days' work crowded into one. Yes, the traffic manager of an important English railway had an easy time as compared with the gentleman who at some wayside railway station in the colony tried to hold the balance between the military and railway authorities. 30 years before the Boer War, a very similar state of things was existent in France, when the Germans and French were locked in the most terrible conflict of modern times. The Germans have pushed their armies across to Paris and are feeding them, reinforcing them, and supplying all the munitions of war over the railway. Bridges and tunnels have been blown up. Desperate men have struck desperate blows for their country by wrecking trains. But the conquering flood still rolls on. There is the same tremendous activity at the railway depots. Apart from its importance, there was not a more interesting place in the whole of the occupied country than the Nancy railway station. At that great crossroads on the high road of the invasion, where the Saarbrück-Paris line and the Strasbourg-Paris line converge and unite, every minute some picture belonging to and formed out of the war presented itself. The beautiful city of Nancy, which as a whole is not less beautiful than Paris, and which, in proportion to its size, possesses more fine streets, spacious squares, and picturesque gardens than any city in France, had returned in a great measure to its normal condition. But the sight of French prisoners always affected the kind-hearted Nankois, and painful scenes used often to occur when prisoners were marched in large bodies through the town. After the surrender of Toul, the prisoners were all sent to Strasbourg or to Saarbrück by rail, and the railway bridge at Nancy was crowded with sympathizing spectators whenever a convoy of prisoners reached the station. The German governmental authorities, therefore, erected a boarding on each side of the railway bridge at Nancy, so that no one might see the trains of prisoners arrive. In view of these unexpected barricades, the townspeople armed themselves with gimlets, and the boards were soon perforated in all directions, and the bridge was crowded whenever it was known that a fresh convoy of captive Frenchmen had come in. The importance of keeping open their railway communications was such that the Germans took a very strong line with would-be train wreckers. To remove rails or place obstacles on the line was a capital offense, when the culprit could be found. If he could not, a fine of $1,000 was imposed on the nearest commune, or, if it could not pay, on the members of the municipal council of the nearest town. The invaders brought with them 5 railway detachments, whose business it was to repair any damage done to the line by the invaded. These detachments consisted of navvies and engineer troops. When the army advanced, they reconnoitered the lines, removed obstructions, restored broken bridges, adapted the existing stations to military purposes, built new stations where required, and directed the traffic. In case of a retreat, on them devolved the role of destroying the track sufficiently to impede the enemy. At Nancy, engines of all kinds had been collected in large numbers. French and German locomotives jostled one another on the 4 main lines and in innumerable sidings. At times, every inch of line, says Mr. Sutherland Edwards, was covered and the trains extended 1/4 of a mile beyond the station each way. To look for any particular train was like looking for a carriage on Epsom Downs. But you could make your search if you liked. You might walk between the trains, cross between the carriages, jump into a carriage while the train was in motion, jump similarly out of it, keep the carriage doors open or shut as you felt inclined. Do anything, in short, except drive the engine. French engine drivers and signalmen were impressed to work the sections of the line that they knew. In order to prevent train wrecking, prominent French citizens were often carried on the engine, where, in case of an explosion or accident, their safety would be imperiled even more than that of the troops in the carriages behind. Armed guards also kept watch over the drivers to see that they did what was required of them. On one occasion, a driver and his stoker overpowered the soldiers and threw them off the engine. They uncoupled the latter in the middle of a tunnel and made off with it until they had covered a mile or more. Then they reversed the gear, turned on steam, and sprang off, leaving the locomotive to dash back into the train and work havoc among the enemies. Such actions, however, rarely occurred, fortunately for the French, since they only served to make the lot of the vanquished harder than it had been before. As soon as the Germans had a firm grip on the length of railway, they proceeded to send artillery over it for the siege of Paris. Hundreds of guns of all weights and ages were loaded into trucks, along with suitable ammunition, of which huge quantities were expended before the capitulation of the metropolis. Here and there, in the neighborhood of a town, and therefore within reach of its guns, the railway had to be deflected onto a temporary track which turned the obstacle, since the guns must be brought up at all costs. In October 1870, 230 pieces of artillery from Germany were delivered at Nanteuil, whence they were distributed by road to various positions surrounding Paris. The Germans had one great advantage over the English as regards the use of a railway as a means of support, in that, supposing the track had been destroyed, they would still have the excellent roads for which France is famous to fall back upon. As we know so well from the printed accounts and photographs, South African roads are alternately dust trails and quagmires, punctuated by terribly difficult drifts, through which long teams of oxen painfully hauled wagons and artillery. Furthermore, our troops were not able to live on the country as did the Germans. They could not requisition food when there was no food. For sustenance, they depended entirely on the railway. In turn, Russia's present position is infinitely more precarious than that of Britain at any period of the Boer War. For 5/6 of the total distance to the front, our troops were transported in commodious vessels, maintaining an uninterrupted speed of 18 to 20 miles an hour for weeks on end. And when they reached dry land below the equator, they might be carried to the front on any one of 4 tracks, from Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, Durban, Beira, as occasion demanded, and 3 of these lines were well laid. Contrast with these facts the case of Russia in her struggle with Japan. She possesses one possible means of communication between Europe and the easternmost parts of Asia, a line nearly 6,000 miles long, which has recently cost her 100 million pounds, is for the most part badly built and strategically weakened by the break at Lake Baikal. The difficulties arising from imperfect construction are aggravated by natural obstacles, chief among which is the intense cold, that for many months in the year aids the winds to smother the track under deep drifts of snow. Have we not read of congestion of traffic, the sufferings of the soldiers, the utter disorganization resulting from the sudden tremendous calls made on the immense railway by the outbreak of war at the eastern extremity? There have been plenty of rumors of bridges wrecked by secret agents, an apparently inevitable feature of a contest in which railways play a part. We read, too, of attempts made to destroy trains after quite the approved methods of the Franco-German War. A favorite device, and one which has often been resorted to, is for some person, evidently familiar with locomotives, to creep onto the engine sheds by night, get up steam on an engine, switch it onto the main line, and then let it run wild after jumping to the ground. Such attempts have ended in failure, thanks to the telegraph, which has enabled the signalmen to turn the runaway into a siding before it encountered a train. On account of the secrecy observed by the Russian authorities with regard to the management and fortunes of the line, little reliable news has filtered through to us. We are fully aware of the strenuous efforts needed to hurry large numbers of fresh troops into Manchuria and to feed them, if the Russians are to have any chance of ultimate success. The situation centers on the railway. If it proves utterly unequal to the strain cast upon it, Russia's hold on Manchuria is gone. As a correspondent of the Daily Express puts it, the railway, is the artery of the war. If the accident of nature or the schemes of the Japanese should fasten a ligature upon it, the Russian cause in the Far East must decay and perish. Apart from its importance, then, there is nothing much to be said of the Trans-Siberian Railway as a war machine. But in America, when the states were convulsed by their terrible civil war, many a romantic incident was connected with the Iron Road. Some of the boldest raids of the cavalry leaders on both sides had as their object the destruction of railways. Bridges were smeared with tar and fired. Rails were torn from their ties, heated in bonfires, and twisted so that they could not possibly be replaced. Then up came a body of troops representing the other side, and workmen organized for this especial service would quickly repair the injured track, and trains would shortly be running as before. It soon became evident that for a really serious destruction of a railway property, the destroying force must occupy the line for a considerable period, and some desperate fighting was witnessed before the stronger party finally managed to tighten its grip on a railway. Then the destroyers set to work in earnest, showing, as has been said, almost as much ingenuity in preparing a means for its ruin as had previously been evinced in its erection. Military writers of the United States ordered that not only should the piles and woodwork of the bridges be smeared with tar, but shells and grenades with fuses of various lengths should be arranged to keep up recurrent explosions in order to prevent any attempt of the enemy to extinguish the fire. In case of a bridge being inaccessible, heavy timber rafts were to be sent down the current to smite them like battering rams. And if these fails, fire vessels should be tried, or floating torpedoes exploded by electricity. The siege of Atlanta, where the Confederate Army had taken up its position against General Sherman, was brought to a successful issue for the Federals only after Sherman had effectively severed the railways connecting Atlanta with the southern states. The general in person superintended the work of demolishing the track. For 12.5 miles, writes one of his staff officers, the ties were burned and the iron rails heated and twisted with the ingenuity of hands old to the work. Several cuts were filled up with the trunks of trees, logs, rocks, and earth, intermingled with loads of shells, prepared as torpedoes to explode in case of an attempt to clear them out. In the neighborhood of Atlanta, one of the most stirring events of the early part of the war was enacted, and its scene was the railway. It may suitably be described in some detail. In March 1862, the Federal and Confederate armies were approaching each other in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. The former, under General O.M. Mitchell, occupied Nashville and Shelbyville on the line running south from Louisville and Cincinnati. The Confederates, who were pushing up northwards, had their base at Atlanta and held the railway which put that town via Chattanooga in communication with Corinth in the west and Richmond in the east. It was along this line, connected, by the by, with the Nashville branch, that their advance lay, and, as long as they occupied it, there was a serious danger of a wedge being driven in between the two Federal divisions. Some men, therefore, volunteered to enter the Confederate lines in disguise and work their way down the railway to Atlanta, where they hoped to be able to capture a locomotive and return north, burning and blowing up bridges as they went, and otherwise rendering the track useless. They reached Atlanta safely, but owing to the absence of the engine driver who was to have joined them there, they had to abandon the project and return to their party as best they might. The leader, Mr. J.J. Andrews, a Kentuckian, did not give up hope. He asked for a larger number of men to help him in a second attempt, and in response, so many volunteers came forward that he was able to select 23 persons best suited for the work in hand. These included 5 engineers, so that in case of a mishap, there might still be left 1 or 2 capable of running a train. The brave little band were drawn from the 21st, 33rd, and 2nd Ohio Regiments. On his first expedition, Mr. Andrews, a man of fine presence, and one who, by his manners and bearing, could easily pass himself off as a cultivated Southern landowner, had possessed himself of a timetable showing the hours at which trains would leave the various stations between Atlanta and Chattanooga. The party assembled by night at an appointed rendezvous in a wood, and there received their final instructions. They were to separate into several groups and travel on foot or in hired conveyances to some station on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad near Chattanooga, and thence travel by rail to Marietta, a station a little north of Atlanta. In order to avoid suspicion, they must represent themselves to be Kentuckians, going south to escape the Federals and join the Confederate Army. If suspected, they should at once enlist in the enemy's ranks. After many adventures, the gallant 24 found themselves in the small hotel outside the Marietta depot. Their position was indeed perilous. As one of them said, our doom might have been fixed before the setting of another sun. We might be hanging to the limbs of some of the trees along the railroad, with an enraged populace jeering and shouting vengeance, because we had no more lives to give up. Or we might leave a trail of fire and destruction behind us and come triumphantly rolling into Chattanooga and Huntsville to receive the welcome plaudits of comrades left behind and the thanks of our general and the praises of a grateful people. The men were to embark on an early morning train and travel in it as far as Big Shanty, where it halted to allow the passengers to get some breakfast. Then would come the chance of uncoupling the engine and a few cars from the rest of the train and making off with them. This program was carried out to a nicety. When the conductor, engineer, firemen, and passengers had adjourned to the refreshment room, the conspirators quickly distributed themselves into their allotted places, and before a cry could be raised, the locomotive and 3 cars were speeding northwards on a journey such as has never been paralleled in railway annals. The steam soon gave out, and it became necessary to halt and replenish the furnace with wood. The fugitives built their chief hopes upon the difficulty that the Southerners would experience in getting a hold of an engine to send in pursuit. At Kingston, 30 miles north of Big Shanty, they would meet an irregular train, and, that once passed, they expected to run at top speed for the nearest bridge, burn it, and hurry on, serving every other bridge they crossed in a like manner. As they went, they would destroy the telegraph so that no messages could be flashed back to Atlanta. Keeping on regular time, they reached Kingston 2 hours after the capture of the train, without having in any way damaged the line. As their own train had been scheduled as irregular, Andrews claimed to be a Confederate officer of high rank, who was running a special powder train through to the army of General Beauregard at Corinth. Unfortunately, the local and southward bound freight was late at Kingston, and the conspirators were obliged to lose valuable time in a siding. At last it arrived and passed, but it carried a red flag signaling that another train was just behind it and must also be awaited. On this Andrews had not calculated, and the fact was soon explained by the conductor of the first train, who said that the Confederate rolling stock was being hurried south before the advance of General Mitchell. To wait would have been fatal. Andrews decided to risk a collision and ran his train on to the main line. A minute later, it was flying north at 40 miles an hour for Adairsville, in hope of reaching that station before the expected freight. A short distance south of this station, the train stopped, and the men dismounted to cut the wires and remove a few rails, which were loaded on the cars along with some sleepers that happened to be stacked there. At Adairsville, they met and passed the expected freight and a passenger train at Calhoun. The road then lay clear to Chattanooga. Their hopes rose. A little north of Calhoun was a bridge spanning the Oostenaula River, which they had determined to burn. As a precautionary measure, Andrews decided to remove a rail to obstruct pursuit by any of the trains which had been passed. They had just wrenched this free when, to their dismay, they saw an engine bearing down upon them. The pursuit had indeed been pressed hard. We must now return to Big Shanty and briefly follow the doings of Fuller, the conductor of the captured train. As the locomotive left the platform, Fuller and two companions pursued it on foot amid the jeers of their companions. He expected that the fugitives would abandon their prize as soon as they had cleared the Confederate outposts, and he therefore hoped to be able to retake the engine and bring it back to his train. But some severed telegraph wires soon undeceived him. The three fell in with a party of workmen and a hand car. These were at once pressed into the service, and the pursuit now continued at 7 or 8 miles an hour. Their one hope of success rested on finding at Etowah, 13 miles from Kingston, an engine which worked a branch line to some ironworks. Great was their delight when they found the old Yonah standing in the station, its head turned towards Kingston. Onto it they sprang, and their former crawl quickened into nearly a mile a minute. But when Kingston was reached, the birds had already flown. Here they changed engines, and with the force of 100 armed men, continued the pursuit until, beyond Calhoun, they sighted their quarry. Transferring our attention once more, we will join Andrews and his party. As they had a rail removed between them and their pursuers, they hoped to be able to burn the bridge before the damage could be put right. But Fuller's train managed, in an almost miraculous manner, to clear the gap and continue merrily on its way. The driver attributes this extraordinary feat to the fact that the blank occurred in the inside rail and on a curve. As the train was traveling at a very high speed, its weight was thrown mostly on the outside rail and kept it up against it by centrifugal force. With quick decision, he increased the speed, and after a sharp jolt, the engine and its cars were on the farther side of the gap. Had Andrews removed an outer rail, the whole history of subsequent events would have been altered. Seeing that it was now impossible to fire the bridge, the brave Northerner cast loose a car in hope that it might wreck the pursuing engine. But Fuller pulled up in time and, picking up the car, proceeded pushing it before the engine. A second car was then dropped with as little effect. The fugitives next proceeded to throw the sleepers they carried onto the track, and so managed to impede the shorter, as the other engine was named. Short halts were made to cut the wires and take in water and fuel. As long as the pursuit had anything on board which could be used as an obstruction, the pursuers were obliged to keep at a respectful distance, just far enough behind to see what was being done by those in front. Thus the chase continued, mile after mile at express speed. Idlers in the stations were amazed by the sight of a train dashing past, closely followed by another. To the travelers, the country appeared to spin past giddily. Then the leading engine would be suddenly reversed, and the brakes applied with such suddenness as to cause the occupants of the one remaining car to cling tightly to its sides. Scarcely had the wheels ceased to revolve when the Northerners were on the track, desperately loading ties or cutting the telegraph wires. At the signal, all sprang aboard again, and the engine bounded forward once more at such a pace that it was a wonder how it kept on the rails at all. Mere speed could not, however, save Andrew's party from an even swifter engine. Not far ahead of them now lay Dalton, a junction for the lines running east and west. It was the southern apex of a triangle of lines, the other two corners being at Cleveland and Chattanooga. If they managed to clear Dalton, it would be of no avail, since news of the flight would reach Chattanooga via Cleveland before the locomotive. However, they passed Dalton unmolested and soon entered a tunnel where they determined to play their last card. With great difficulty, they set the car ablaze and cast it adrift on a long covered bridge. The other party simply pushed it ahead to the next siding and left it there to burn. Now little remained but to abandon the railway and to make for the Northern Army across country through the woods and mountains. Some of their bolder spirits did indeed suggest that it would be worthwhile to form an ambuscade near an obstruction and, while their pursuers were hard at work, to fire upon them, board their train, and send it flying back to collide with the one following behind. But Andrews overruled this suggestion, and the flight continued at a slower speed as the supply of fuel now began to fail. 12 miles from Chattanooga, the fugitives reversed their engine, jumped off, and left it to do any evil that the exhausted furnace could urge it to. Fortunately for those behind, the general's force was expended, and it came to a standstill before reaching them. With the subsequent adventures of the brave 24, their capture, imprisonment, the execution of 8, including Andrews, the escape of 8 more, and the final exchange of the remainder, we will not here deal, as they are in no way connected with the railroad. It will be interesting, however, to notice the opinions held by both sides as regards the importance of the enterprise which so nearly succeeded. The expedition failed, says Judge Advocate General Holt in a report to the Secretary of War, from causes which reflected neither upon the genius by which it was planned, nor by the intrepidity and discretion of those engaged in executing it. But for the accidental meeting of these trains, which could not have been anticipated, the movement would have been a complete success, and the whole aspect of the war in the South and Southwest could have been at once changed. The expedition itself, in the daring of its conception, has the wildness of a romance, while in the gigantic and overwhelming results which it sought and was likely to accomplish, it was absolutely sublime. A Southern journal says, "We doubt if the victory of Manassas or Corinth were worth as much to us as the frustration of this grand coup d'etat. It is not by any means certain that the annihilation of Beauregard's whole army at Corinth would be so fatal a blow to us as would have been the burning of the bridges at that time and by these men." The pluck shown by Andrews and his comrades was equaled by the determination of Fuller and his party. The people who at Big Shanty mocked the conductor as he pursued the train on foot little knew that the pedestrian feat was to avert a great disaster from the Southern arms. Fuller thoroughly deserved all the credit he got. Note, for a more detailed description of this incident, the reader is referred to Capturing a Locomotive by the Reverend W. Pittenger, who was himself one of Andrews' associates. End of Chapter 19. Read by Edward Foster, Sunrise Beach, Missouri.
Chapter 20 of The Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. The Electric Railway. It may be asked, what has electricity got to do with the romance of steam locomotion? just what the Romans had to do with the Carthaginians, or the English of Elizabeth's day to do with the Spaniards. You cannot discuss the fortunes of an individual, a nation, or an invention without some reference to the rivalry to which each is subject. Steam locomotion is, at the present time, being hard beset by two powerful rivals. The one, electricity, most evident in connection with vehicles that move on rails. The other, the energy of the petrol engine, which propels carriages over rails and roads. To appreciate how formidable a competitor the former is, we have only to look round the metropolis of any highly civilized country. The horse, as the patient mover of the tram car, will soon be seen no more. In London, simply on account of the inconvenience of relaying the tracks. The surface electric car has not yet become general, but in the suburbs and large provincial towns, the subtle current has driven our faithful four-legged servant out of the field. The fight is rapidly extending to urban and suburban railways, both on the surface and below. The many tubes that burrow like huge mole runs through London clay and gravel are all worked electrically. The Metropolitan Railway, which for 40 years has filled our lungs with sulphurous fumes, will also soon find itself metamorphosed into the abode of clean, fresh air. Some of the suburban steam railways are also being weighed in the balances, and if they prove wanting, as compared with those already dominated by the electric current, they too will alter the fashion of their motive power. The same story can be told of Paris, Vienna, New York, Boston, and other large cities, and schemes are already mooted for converting stretches of track hundreds of miles long, notably in Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. The last named country may with justice be termed the cradle of the electric railway. It contains no less than 150 such tracks over 50 miles in length. New York has been joined to Boston by an electric line, 185 miles in length. The Jersey City electric system now reaches to within a few miles of Philadelphia. The New York Elevated has shelved its steam engines, so has the Manhattan Elevated. In short, the era of electric traction has already left its dawn some way behind, and is making its influence seriously felt in the dominions of King Steam. The great advantages claimed for the electric motor are its cleanliness, its rapid acceleration of speed, the flexibility which it gives to all traffic that it works. Every electrically driven vehicle can be run independently or as a unit of a series, so that the size of a train may very easily be accommodated to the number of the passengers that it will have to carry at different periods of the day. A further point in favor of the employment of electricity arises from the ease and cheapness with which it can be generated in countries where large water power is available. By deflecting mountain streams and waterfalls into the maws of turbines, a huge quantity of hitherto wasted natural energy is brought into the service of man, and so transformed that it can be led hither and thither through a small wire. Because the electric railways with which we are at present acquainted do not to any great extent surpass their steam rivals in speed, it must not be inferred that the electric locomotive is necessarily a slow hoss. Several years ago an accumulator-driven motor was tried on one of the French railways in the place of the steam locomotive, which usually drew the express, and it gave a very good account of itself, attaining in places, with a heavy load, a speed of 60 miles an hour. This machine was only of the nature of an experiment, as the expense of laying wires along the track to supply a motor with current would have been too considerable. The ordinary electric locomotive of today is not self-contained like the steamer. It is merely furnished with motors to transform current generated elsewhere into power, contact being made with the source of supply either by means of a third and insulated rail laid between the two wheel rails, or through a trolley arm carrying a wheel which runs along an overhead wire. The following quotation from the old Thunderer gives an insight into the electrification of American railways. At Los Angeles, California, an important network of tramways has been started by the Pacific Electric Railway Company, the president of which is Mr. H. E. Huntington. From a conversation I had with him, I found he is strongly convinced that the tractive force of the future is electricity, notwithstanding the fact that it was from the steam railways that his famous relative made his fortune. The company in question was only formed in February, 1902, yet by the following July it had completed and begun to operate a new line of tramway between Los Angeles and Long Beach, a favorite seaside resort 21 miles distant. The cars start from the streets of Los Angeles in the ordinary way, but as soon as possible on reaching the outskirts of the city, they leave the highway and enter on what seems to be, to all intents and purposes, an ordinary railway line, fenced in on each side and having a double set of rails, but provided with overhead wires for the electric current. There are very few curves in the track and the grade is uniform throughout, while the road bed of the line seemed to be as solid as that of any well-built railway. Our car being a "special," it ran express from Los Angeles to Long Beach, and the journey of 21 miles was done in just over half an hour. But the company expect that when they get the full amount of the power for which they have arranged, they will run their express cars at the rate of 60 miles an hour, though the full equipment would then allow of a speed of 75 or even 90 miles an hour. Any such speed as this would of course be maintained only along those parts of the track which represent the private right of way, and would not be attempted either at Los Angeles or at Long Beach, where the ordinary streets are passed through. These developments at Los Angeles are significant of a great deal that is going on in the United States, though the company in question may be in an especially favored position, because it hopes eventually to get electricity equal to 25,000 horsepower at a cost of only about half a cent per horsepower per hour, by generating it at the Kern River and conveying it thence to Los Angeles, a distance of 200 miles. A good deal has been heard and written lately about the projected monorail line between Manchester and Liverpool. Mr. F. B. Bear is the chief exponent of this form of electrically driven railway, the main feature of which is that the metals are mounted on the apices of a succession of trestles, so as to allow the carriage to hang saddle fashion apart on each side. He built an experimental track 7 miles long to connect the Brussels Exhibition of 1897 with Tervuren. The rail ran 4 feet above the sleepers on steel trestles bolted down to sleepers of the same material. To quote from another place, the carriage Mr. Bear used, but one on this line, weighed 68 tons, was 59 feet long and 11 feet wide, and could accommodate 100 persons. It was handsomely fitted up and had specially shaped seats, which neutralized the effect of rounding curves, and ended fore and aft in a point to overcome the wind resistance in front and the air suction behind. 16 pairs of wheels on the underside of the carriage engaged with the 2 pairs of guide rails flanking the trestles, and 8 large double-flanged wheels, 4½ feet in diameter, carried the weight of the vehicle. The inner 4 of these wheels were driven by as many powerful electric motors contained, along with the guiding mechanism in the lower part of the car. The motors picked up current from the center rail and from another steel rail laid along the sleepers on porcelain insulators. This car attained a top speed of 90 miles an hour. Mr. Bear, encouraged by this performance, obtained parliamentary powers to build a similar line over the 34½ miles separating Cottonopolis and Liverpool. At present matters have not gone beyond the paper stage, and the citizens of these 2 great towns must still content themselves with the 45-minute express service available on these separate lines. Perhaps in a few years we may see the strange, balanced cars flying along at the 100-mile-an-hour pace promised by Mr. Bear. As we noticed in Chapter 18, 90 miles an hour has been soundly beaten by the express steam locomotive, which has a mile covered in 30 seconds to its credit. But even this marvelous performance pales before the velocity attained by an electric car in the Berlin-Zossen Railway, which has given a very startling proof of the possibilities of electric traction. Two German engineers, Messrs. Rathenau and Schweiger, were traveling one night in a sleeping car between Berlin and Milan, when they began to discuss the subject of railway speeds. Before the discussion ended, they had determined to carry out some practical tests. On their return home they looked about for financial support, which they found in the offers of Messrs. Siemens and Halske, the General Electric Company, numerous banks, manufacturers and scientists, and the War Minister to aid them in every way. The German railroad authorities placed at the engineers' disposal the 14¼ mile stretch of military line between Marienfeld, near Berlin, and Zossen. The Siemens and Halske Company undertook the construction of the line, supplying the electric power, while the GEC guaranteed a sufficient amount of current from their electrical generating station at Oberschwanweid, 7 miles northeast of Marienfeld. This line was, by virtue of the absence of all but the slightest curves and gradients, peculiarly suitable for the experiments, but the permanent way, with its light rails, inferior sleepers, and poor ballasting, left much to be desired. The authorities therefore improved both sleepers and roadbed before commencing the tests, which in 1901 produced a speed of nearly 100 miles an hour. The track was so badly knocked about by the passage of the cars that during the summer of 1902 a new track was laid beside the old, having much heavier metals placed on fir sleepers and broken basalt. 17 meters of the total distance were equipped with guard rails, such as are used on ordinary railway bridges, laid inside the wheel rails and at a distance of about 2 inches from them. Besides preventing derailment, they greatly strengthened the whole of the roadbed. The current for these experiments was supplied at a pressure of about 15,000 volts from 3 copper wires carried on poles 7 feet from the middle of the track, and transmitted to the motors through 6 arms swinging on 2 upright masts attached to the car top, one at each end. 2 cars were used for the trials, the bodies being made by Messrs. Van der Zijpen and Charlier, and the motors coming from the works of the Siemens, Halske, and GEC. Each car carried 4 motors, each of 250 horsepower, was 68 feet long, accommodated 50 passengers, and weighed about 100 tons. The body of the car rests upon 2 6-wheeled trucks, the motors operating the 2 outside axles of each truck. The wheels are 4 feet in diameter and are controlled by Westinghouse air, hand, and electric brakes. The air brakes alone give a pressure of 150 tons on the wheel treads. The Siemens car was first given a run on the new track. In September 1903, it attained 189 kilometers, 112 miles per hour. On October 6th, the pace was improved to 201 kilometers, 126 miles, to the great astonishment of the crowds of spectators. Over and over again 8 minutes sufficed to cover the 14¼ miles from start to finish. The engineering world was still metaphorically electrified by this performance, when on October 23rd the same car broke its own record with a 207 kilometers, 128½ miles dash. Meanwhile, the GEC car had been at work, and its driver coaxed it to 210 kilometers, 130½ miles per hour, so eclipsing the feats of the other vehicle. Even at these terrific velocities, there was very little vibration. As the maximum authorized speed had now been reached, the trials were concluded, though the engineers felt confident that another 12 miles an hour could be added without danger to track or rolling stock. One of the half-dozen persons who traveled in the car has recorded his experiences of a journey made at more than 2 miles a minute. "I think," he says, "that I might fairly compare my own feelings at the start of my journey to those of a novice making the first balloon trip. Traveling at what seems an unnatural speed, we were largely facing a group of unknown dangers, just as in aerial flight. Something unforeseen might happen, with consequences as frightful as anything that could befall an aeronaut, for collision, collapse, or derailment of a train traveling at over 100 miles an hour must have fearful consequences. Experimental as was the trip, who could be sure that somebody had not miscalculated something? The track, trolley wires, motors, any one of them might unexpectedly fail. Before starting on the trip, I was reminded in a suggestive way that it was not absolutely unattended with risk. The idea was politely and kindly conveyed to me in the shape of a piece of paper. I was to be specially insured against death or injury in the event of an accident by the Deutsche Bank, in compliance with the formality of Prussian law. It was a novel experience, and strange to say, as is generally the case when undergoing anything unusual afloat, ashore, or in the air, not one of us felt the slightest nervousness. The chief excitement experienced by myself and my fellow travelers was in watching the meter record the changes in our speed as it gradually grew faster and faster. The car is in shape not unlike a boat. At each end its windows meet in a point forming as it were a nose to pierce the wall of air in front. At each end is a place for the motorman, who, by means of 3 wheels, a handle, and the brake, controls at will the enormous outside forces which make such a speed possible. The motorman slowly turned on the current of 14,000 volts, and the car began to move gradually forward. As it did so it made a humming noise, but we felt no kind of sensation or jerkiness, the motion being smoothness itself. Our first recorded speed was only 45 miles, but in a little over a mile this had increased to 68, and then to 85. Faster and faster, and we had reached a speed of 108 miles, when my sensations of rapid travel began in earnest. There was of course the old illusion of passing objects. Trees, buildings, posts seemed to be rushing past us, and we ourselves to be stationary. All the time we felt a desire to go faster and faster. Even when traveling at 130 miles an hour, we chafed that we moved so slowly. We had indeed for a while become speed maniacs. Bewildering in the extreme were many of the sensations. Looking out through the front windows, I noticed with trepidation that we were approaching a bend in the line. So furious was our advance that I could not conceive that the train could possibly take the curve without derailment. A few seconds, every emotion was an affair of seconds or fractions of them, and I saw that my fright was laughable. The train glided around the curve with an easy grace, and the fear was past. Once we had attained our high speed, we began to notice a strange, puzzling musical sound, a continuous hum. Even my experienced fellow travelers themselves could not exactly account for it, as it did not come from any vibration of the machinery, but at length we found the solution. Our passage was so furious that stones, sand, dust, every movable object on the track whipped in dozens against the carriage with such rapidity as to give forth a continuous note. A rushing sound behind us came from nothing else than the fallen autumn leaves, which followed us in a cyclone. We were too excited to talk. Now and again a remark was made, but the speaker was generally frowned down. There was one exciting incident. Standing right in the track, some 800 yards away, were 2 men, who seemed to be quietly chatting, unconscious of the approaching monster. Our whistle shrieked, and they fortunately rushed away, but none too soon. For although they were half a mile distant, that does not mean safety in the case of such a train as ours. Little less marvelous than our speed in full flight was our pulling up. The brake was put on within 1,000 yards of the journey's end. At first it was applied gradually, and then at its full force. Although the current too had been switched off, yet the car slid into Zossen on its own momentum. It has been calculated that if the electricity were suddenly cut off when the car traveled at 130 miles per hour, it would have continued to progress for 17 miles. To make these figures more suggestive, the writer of the above account asks us to imagine a train from which the motive power has been suddenly removed at Hatfield, reaching King's Cross before coming to a standstill. Considering the great advances made recently in electric traction, it will not be a matter for surprise if in a few years Rhodesia is traversed by some very fast electric trains. The transmission of power to a long distance is a comparatively easy matter nowadays, and in the Victoria Falls of the Zambesi, Rhodesia has the greatest source of energy that the world can offer to man. The falls plunge 400 feet into a zigzag chasm, over a lip 1 mile wide, so that even the immense power of Niagara itself is here completely dwarfed. By means of turbines, the smoke that sounds will be partially converted into electric current to send cars spinning along the metals of the Rhodesian section of the Cape to Cairo line. To the native, the relations between the flying car and the magnificent waterfall will for some years be hard to understand, though the passage of the telegraph line through his country has given him a glimmering of the mysterious ways of electricity. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. The Railway Mania. Every now and then a nation loses its head over financial matters, goes money mad, and speculates wildly in a fashion that can have but one ending, the ending of a gambler. We all know something of the famous South Sea bubble, which in Queen Anne's reign ruined thousands of thrifty folk and left behind it many a desolated home and suicide's grave. £100 shares of the South Sea Company's stock changed hands for £1,000 or more. Then the reaction set in. The shares fell in value with terrible rapidity and soon were worth little more than the paper of the scrip. It took all Walpole's financial genius to save the credit of the nation from being lost amid the general catastrophe. Even more disastrous in its consequences was the mania for buying and selling shares in existing or projected railways, which twice seized the British public, the first time in 1836 and again in the years 1843 to 45. In the early 30s, the railway had few friends. Those people who were not openly hostile to it were either utterly indifferent to its development or cynical. As a few years ago caricaturists heaped ridicule on the motor car, today a great power in the land, so then every comic draftsman or scribbler must have his fling at the dangerous, noisy, smelly, illness-causing, ugly locomotive, epithets which by no means exhaust the list of adjectives applied to the steam horse. But in spite of the jeering, the faithful few persevered, and the despised railway soon began to pay dividends of 10 and even 15%. In 1836, money was easy, that is, plentiful, and profitable investments were hard to find, so that before long the railways attracted the attention of the financial world. People suddenly discovered that the earning of a good dividend covered a multitude of sins. The iron track, once everybody's butt, blossomed into a great civilizer, a priceless boon, a triumph of peace, and so on, according to the command of language enjoyed by the journalist who rushed into print in praise of the new panacea for all evils social and political. Folk tumbled over one another in their eagerness to buy scrip. The wildest schemes for new lines found immediate support. Nothing seemed too idiotic, when the public had for the time become a race of idiots, among whom only a few men, such as George Stephenson, managed to keep a cool head. Huge fortunes were made and lost in a week or two. Paupers became rich men, millionaires sank into poverty. Trickery and knavery of all sorts was rampant. The industrial balance of the country was upset, and the year ended amid the gloom of acute monetary depression. Yet the speculation of 1836 was but a mild gamble compared with that of the second period, 1843 to 45. Once again people looked about for something which would yield a better return than consols, now above par and so scarcely worth buying. The mania commenced in 1843, was continued in 1844, and arrived at its height in 1845, during which thousands of persons were ruined by the absurd rush for shares. Railway schemes grew with a mushroom growth. In January 1845, 16 new lines were registered, and in the 11 months following, more than 1,200 lines were projected, a very small proportion of which ever received parliamentary powers. No part of the country was too barren, too remote, too poverty-stricken, too thinly populated, to be described by the projector as affording an opening for a most profitable line. In one place a railway was advocated because it would run over the route once taken by a Roman road. In another district a sufficient cause was found in the fact that a Danish invasion had once passed that way. As during the cycle mania of a few years ago, everything and everybody connected with the cycle trade enjoyed a sudden boom, so during the furor of 1843 to 45 did the railway press, the railway expert, even the individual who had the shallowest acquaintance with railway matters, find themselves inundated with business. 100 newspapers sprang into existence, reaped a great harvest out of the advertisements, which sometimes in a single journal amounted to £10,000 a week, and expired in a few months. Men who could draw, survey, or in any way make themselves useful to the promoter received princely salaries ranging upwards to £10 a day. The most magnificent schemes were carried through on paper. Extraordinary public boons were brought home to the railway on paper. Writers excelled themselves in flights of imagination which saw the railway leveling all class distinctions, and replacing poverty and discontent by comfort and universal brotherly kindness among men. This again was only a matter of paper. Arguments were forthcoming to prove that, however much money was sunk in railways, it must eventually benefit the community by keeping the wealth of the nation on the move. Lord Bacon saying that "money is like muck, and does no good till it is spread," was adduced as a testimony to the advantages of pouring the wealth of the public into the pockets of the engineer and navvy, who now became familiar figures all over the country. The navvy, a much more uncouth person in those times than he is at present, caused consternation and often terror among the country folk with whom he came in contact. Cases of robbery and outrage were numerous, and the law, as represented by a few constables, was powerless to maintain order in the large camps of the navigators. The surveyors also showed a sad lack of manners, being attracted on the one hand by the rewards accruing from business successfully carried through, and encouraged on the other by the wealthy companies for whom they worked. Collecting bands of ruffians, they set the landowners at defiance, with the natural result that there were some very pretty scuffles, when the owners also organized a force to resist the invaders. A fair instance of such conflicts has already been given in the case of the Harborough estate. By 1845 the rage of speculation had become so acute that the police had often to be called in to regulate the crowds besieging the stock exchanges of London and other large cities. Amid the general rush for money, the railway did indeed, to some extent, prove a leveler, for people of all classes jostled one another in their haste to purchase the scrip dangled temptingly before their eyes by this or that promoter. Vainly did sober journals such as the Times urge caution and self-control, prophesying the crash that must follow so unhealthy a growth of railway schemes. They might as well have asked a man dying of thirst to content himself with half a pint an hour, when at last he falls in with a pool of clear, sweet water. Meanwhile, the parliamentary horse was being worked to death. 561 bills came before the Commons. Nearly 300 of these were promptly slaughtered, and the rest received the royal assent. Finally, the legislators' patience gave out, and the Board of Trade fixed November 30th, 1845, as the day by which all plans of further projected lines must be deposited. Then ensued such a scene as cannot be paralleled in the history of finance. The boom was already showing signs of a break, and it became absolutely necessary for such schemes as should be saved from ruin to be given parliamentary powers to commence work at once. November 30th happened to be a Sunday, and this led to some difficulties. Never was the first day of the week less a day of rest. At 12 o'clock, the offices of the Board of Trade would be closed. Promoters hired special trains, special coaches, or special relays of horses to bear their plans to the metropolis. In some cases a railway refused to carry people interested in a scheme that might prove harmful to it, and all sorts of devices were resorted to evade the officials. A story is told of a large roll of plans being placed in a coffin, which was taken to the station on a hearse, attended by mourners wearing all the outward signs of deep sorrow. The coffin, on reaching London, was driven straight to the Board of Trade offices, where its contents found their last resting place. Postboys were bribed to drive their fares astray, or pretend ignorance of the road. Wheels were loosened, horses stolen. Scarcely a mean trick went unused. On the other hand, some very remarkable running occurred on the railways, as may be gathered from the fact that one planned special covered the 118 miles between Bristol and London in an hour and a half, at an average speed of nearly 80 miles an hour. Of course, many plans arrived too late, and the bearers, driven to desperation, hurled them in through the windows, from which they were as speedily ejected. Then came the crash. Prices fell by leaps and bounds. Everybody wished to sell, nobody to buy. Thousands found themselves penniless, and trade so bad that many avenues of earning even a pittance were closed against them. Some resorted to suicide, the final act of despair, and an even greater number languished in prison until their debts should be paid. The battle had been much severer even than that of the parties who strove during the South Sea bubble, and the dead and wounded were proportionately more numerous. Among the speculators of those wild days, no one could vie with the Railway King, as George Hudson was named. He may be called the Napoleon of the mania, for although he outgeneraled his opponents, won many brilliant victories, and had the financial world at his feet, he eventually found his Waterloo. It must be placed to his credit that even if, after the manner of conquerors, he caused a great deal of misery, he did some really good work in the cause of railway extension, notably as regards the Midland system, of which he was the first chairman. Born in 1800, he began life as a linen draper's assistant in York. When 32 years old, he had attracted notice on the Board of Health of his town, and in 1837 was elected Lord Mayor. 2 years later he took a prominent part in the opening of the York and North Midland Railway, which owed its existence largely to his perseverance and business capacity. In 1842 he was appointed chairman of the North Midland Railway, and in 1844, when that line amalgamated with the Midland counties and Birmingham and Derby Junction, he accepted the chairmanship of the joint concern. During the mania Mr. Hudson fought a fierce parliamentary battle on behalf of the Midland against the proposed London and York scheme. As a fighter he was seen at his best, cool, untiring, cheerful. When once he took a project in hand, he devoted his whole energy to it until he emerged victorious, or knew that the cause was hopelessly lost. As a consequence he was much sought after as a director by companies outside his own. His word became law. A few strokes of his pen carried as much weight as an Act of Parliament. He had an interest in practically every railway between Edinburgh and London. He plunged magnificently, buying by the £100,000 where other men were content to invest or risk their thousands. At one time he controlled over 1,000 miles of railway. He became a popular hero, was cheered wherever he went, and in addition to 2 re-elections to the York mayoralty, was returned by Sunderland as its Member of Parliament. Whether intentionally or not, Hudson became involved in transactions that savored of fraud, and in 1846, at a meeting of the Midland Board called for the purpose of deciding whether they should buy up the Leeds and Bradford line, recently opened. He was openly accused of consulting his own interests rather than those of the shareholders whom he represented, because, as chairman of the Leeds and Bradford, he had advocated the purchase of that line by the Midland. Though he apparently cleared himself from the charges of misappropriation, his reputation had received a blow from which it never recovered. The railway king now fell on evil times. He, whom the prince consort had once asked to be introduced to him, became the target at which every caricaturist launched his shaft. It was vain for him to state, "It has been my good or bad fortune to be the purchaser of many railways, and I might frequently have taken advantage of my position and knowledge to go into the market and lay out large sums with great benefit to myself. But I publicly declare that I have not done so, and call upon any person who can prove anything to the contrary to come forward and do it at once." Satirists delighted to recall his draper days, and represented him sitting in his shop at the mouth of a tunnel learning how a great deal of railway business may be kept in the dark, or seated in spider shape at the center of a huge railway web to catch the shareholders for whom he had spun the meshes. Last scene of all, George Hudson, alone and deserted on a platform, vainly trying to stop the train which was leaving him in the lurch. At an extraordinary meeting of the Midland shareholders, held at Derby, April 19, 1849, Mr. Hudson, in a letter of considerable length, stated, "After due deliberation, I have thought it right, and to be more satisfactory to the shareholders of the Midland Railway Company, to resign the office of chairman." The 1,000 proprietors there assembled also found his action most satisfactory, and his connection with the Midland was thus severed. He had undoubtedly been playing a double game which an honorable man could not have reconciled with his conscience. He had, while professing undivided loyalty to the Midland, taken a share in obtaining a parliamentary sanction for a short line, which, by connecting the Great Northern with the Manchester and Leeds Railway, deflected on to the metals of the former company a large amount of trade hitherto handled by the Midland. When this was discovered, after his resignation, the shareholders naturally maintained that he had betrayed their interests and demanded a committee of inquiry. In 1853, judgment was given against him in the Rolls Court, requiring him to account for various blocks of shares which he had appropriated, as well as for those with which influential members of Parliament had been bribed to aid the passage of bills introduced by him. After that every boardroom was closed against him, and though Sunderland re-elected him till 1859, his power had departed, and he took himself off to the Continent, there to indulge, on a smaller scale, in schemes such as had won him notoriety in England. Till the last he retained his self-confidence, and paraded his unjust treatment, as he deemed it, at the hands of those whom he had served. He was lucky to have friends who stuck to him through evil as well as good report, and by generous gifts saved him from the fate which overtakes the majority of fallen men, to die poverty-stricken in a wretched garret. This brief account of the man to whose piping the railways of England danced for nearly a couple of decades may fitly be closed with the words of Mr. Clement E. Stretton, who says, "The greatness of Hudson's railway genius only makes it all the more lamentable that so great a man should have so deplorably fallen, and have been guilty of acts which resulted in ruin and universal condemnation. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of the Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Prajakta. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. The Grain Elevator, the Railway, and the World's Food Supply. It has been said that the opening of the Canadian Pacific Railway aimed a more deadly blow at the prosperity of English agriculture than it had yet received. At first sight, the connection between the Canadian highway and farmer Hesed may appear obscure, but a little consideration will show that in a world where the balance of trade is easily upset, the sudden entry of the virgin lands of Manitoba, Assiniboia, and Alberta into competition with the broad acres of Old England could not but have a very adverse effect on English farming. On the one hand, we see an almost boundless expanse of open prairie, cheaply bought, easily tilled. On the other, cramped fields, high rents, and a need for the constant enriching of the soil. While the English farmer is compelled to turn his plough or other gear about every few hundred yards, his Canadian brother can drive his mower or harvester a mile or more right ahead and employ machinery which cannot do itself justice within the limits of a 10-acre field. But however plentifully the Canadian plains may yield their crops of grain, the grain itself would be to a large extent useless did there not exist some means of conveying it to the millions of mouths awaiting it outside Canada. It is the railway that in the Dominion, as elsewhere, plays so important a part in the distribution of the world's food. Were the railways suddenly spirited away by some evil genie, we should soon find ourselves on the verge of starvation. Though at a distance, thousands upon thousands of tons of grain would be rotting for want of a consumer. In conjunction with the steamship, the locomotive has proved one of the greatest benefactors of mankind. Famines, where not rendered an impossibility, are at least greatly mitigated by the speed with which the lands that have can transmit their surplus to the lands that have not, pitching it into wagons which fly hundreds of miles to the sea coast and transfer their cargoes to the ships to be delivered back at the voyage end to the railway for final distribution. One of the most remarkable features of the recent Indian famines was the celerity with which food of various kinds poured into the stricken provinces from distant regions. The loaf that graces your breakfast table may be made of wheat that once waved in Canada, Dakota, Texas, Chile, Argentina, Egypt, Russia, France, or India. The chances are greatly against its being of British origin. If that loaf could speak, it might tell you a very interesting story, but being dumb, let its tale be narrated by the proxy of pen and ink, a tale so closely bound up with that of the iron horse as to be fitly included in an account of steam locomotion. We will go straight to the greatest corn growing country of all, the United States, where a bountiful nature, working hand in hand with the latest inventions of agricultural science, produces yearly nearly 1,000 million bushels of wheat, in addition to 2.5 times that quantity of maize and enormous weights of barley, oats, rye, and buckwheat. Out in North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas flourish the bonanza wheat farms, covering each 6 or 7 square miles. These gigantic wheat fields have developed from the free grants given years ago by government to the railway companies as an encouragement to push their metals from east to west of the continent. For convenience sake, the land was sold in very large blocks, now often the property of a single man who has imported the newest machinery and conducts operations on a scale that is quite unknown to the English yeoman. The owner often does not reside on his land but entrusts its management to an overseer who thoroughly understands the nature of the soil and bears the whole responsibility of sowing and gathering in the crops. Everything about these farms is large. The stables can house 160 horses, the barns hold 500 or more tons of hay, the reaping and other machines may be counted by the score, and each machine may require the force of 20 horses for its propulsion. On such spacious properties, often situated in districts where hands cannot easily be got, machinery takes the place of human labor to an extent scarcely equaled in any other part of the world. The ploughing is done by gang ploughs capable of turning over 4 to 6 acres of soil a day, since the season when such work can be performed is short. In the spring, huge harrows are used to pulverize the soil for a width of 25 feet. Compare this with the 6 or 7 feet of English practice. At a rate of perhaps 100 acres per dime, one man can attend to a single harrow. Sowing is conducted with 4-horse drills whose progress on a windy day is marked by a dense dust cloud, often obscuring men, horses, and machine. Sowing finished, the sun and rain are left to do their work till the harvest approaches. The first signs of ripening send the overseer to the nearest town where he buys the available labor at rates which in another country would appear princely. As soon as the men are hired, the self-binding reapers come forth from their resting places for another period of activity. It is no uncommon sight to see 20 or more of these wonderfully ingenious machines following one another round a huge grain field into which they eat many yards every circuit. The sheaves, ready bound, pour from their collecting boards and are arranged in stooks by skillful workers who set them so firmly that a high wind can hardly affect them. The threshing engine now has its turn, moving from place to place in order to save as far as possible the labor of transporting the sheaves which are hurried into the maw of the buzzing drums. The straw, so much valued in some countries, is here either used as fuel or collected into huge piles and burned. One of the most extraordinary machines in the world is the combined header and thresher propelled by 2 or 3 dozen horses. It cuts a swath 50 feet wide, just removing the heads from the stalks, threshes out the corn as it moves, separates the chaff from the wheat, and delivers the grain duly weighed into sacks. Sometimes the horses are replaced by a gigantic traction engine moving on wheels 5 or 6 feet wide so that it may not sink into the earth. This juggernaut will sack 100 acres of wheat in a dozen hours. It can, however, be used only in regions such as California, where a rainfall is a very rare occurrence and the wheat gets dead ripe without shelling out. The clean grain is dumped into wagons and hauled to an elevator at a railroad station. The farmer has not to go into open market with his samples and sell his crop for the best price he can get. He merely takes it to the nearest elevator capable of holding 10,000 to 50,000 bushels, the property of some individual or company dealing in grain. The prices vary from day to day, like those of stocks and shares, and the farmer delivers his grain when he thinks it will stand at a good figure. His whole crop is transferred from the wagons to the elevator, and the check is given him for its full value. Then his part of the business is at an end. The grain business, therefore, much resembles the oil trade of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. Individual wells are connected by small pipes to the trunk lines operated by companies. The owner of a well turns, say, 10,000 barrels from his own reservoir into these trunk lines, which run for hundreds of miles to a seaport. He obtains a receipt, which is negotiable like an ordinary check. The wheat accumulates in the elevator until the latter is full and must be emptied into cars, which remove it to elevators of far larger dimensions at Chicago, Duluth, or Buffalo on the Great Lakes or to some seaport. The Chicago elevators alone can hold between them nearly 30 million bushels. The elevator is an outcome of the need for being able to cope with an increase in the corn yield of a season. While the farmer wishes to get his crop off his hands as soon as possible, the middleman to whom he sells it may be compelled by the state of prices to hold his purchase so as to avoid glutting the market. Only a fraction of the total crop of the United States is consumed at home, and the balance must be retained in stock till the crops of other countries can be estimated. Then the prices become steady and the grain companies begin to sell, watching any chance of a rise. There are two varieties of elevator: the receiving house or storehouse and the transfer house. The first named structures are located on shore, but at cities on the American Great Lakes and along the Atlantic seaboard can be found floating elevators by which the contents of the lighter or canal boat are discharged into the hold of the ship. The transfer elevators are usually located at the waterside as they are intended for moving grain from vessel to car and vice versa. If they are marine elevators, the plans provide for running the grain cars directly into the structure, tracks being laid along the ground floor of the building. If the location is such that this plan is impracticable, the track is laid along the side and from openings in the buildings project the receiving legs or spouts, which are from 15 to 25 feet in length and hinged so that they can be hoisted against the side of the building when not in use. The end of the spout is carried into the car by the feeder, who moves it from place to place as the contents of the car are emptied. With the spouts in modern use, all of the grain, with the exception of a few shovels full, can be taken out so that the only manual labor required is that of the feeder. As an ordinary leg will elevate from 9,000 to 10,000 bushels an hour, a train load of 30 to 40 cars representing 1,500 tons can be passed into the building in this time if it have the average number of receiving spouts. The nature, then, of a transfer elevator is merely that of a machine for shifting grain from one place to another. The storage elevator takes upon it the function of the houses built by Joseph in which to amass wheat against the coming famine. The largest specimen stands at West Superior, Wisconsin. It can hold over 3 million bushels. Owing to the immense weight carried by such structures, they are based upon a very thick foundation of concrete. To accommodate the grain, great metal cylinders 80 to 90 feet long are reared on end, side by side, and enclosed with a wall of stone or brick. These bins are of varying capacity, the largest ranging to 25,000 bushels. Above the bins is the distributing floor. Above that, the scale room. Above that, again, the cleaning garners. And on the top of all rises the power floor. When a train load of grain arrives at the elevator, a conveyor is laid down into the cars in succession. This may be either an endless belt of buckets which fill and discharge automatically as the belt moves, or a wood or metal conduit from which the air is partially exhausted by means of a fan so as to produce a powerful suction. On arriving at the top of the elevator, the grain passes through sieves which remove foreign matter. It then flows to the next floor where are a number of weighing bins. As soon as a certain amount, 10,000 to 15,000 bushels of grain has entered a bin, a door opens in the bottom and the contents are shot into a storage bin or out of the building into a vessel as the case may be. From the storage bins, the grain is delivered to a ship by spouts of much larger capacity than the receiving spouts, working separately or in unison. 4 of these spouts will transfer 100,000 bushels in an hour. In some places liable to inundation by a sudden rise of the river or sea adjacent, the elevator must be built some way back from the water's edge. The delivery spout is then replaced by belt conveyors spanning 500 to 1000 feet, which run through covered belt galleries to a wharf at which vessels can tie up. In the most up-to-date structures, electricity plays an important part as the motive power by which all the running gear is worked. Externally, the elevator is anything but picturesque. Its tall slab sides rise a couple of 100 feet without any pretense of ornamentation. So lofty are these buildings that they dominate all their surroundings. But they are most useful, and to them is due to no small extent the cheapness of wheat which we convert into the staff of life, since they save a large amount of labor that otherwise would be expended on handling the grain. We thus see that from the moment that a grain of wheat is placed in the sowing drill to the time when it reaches the consumer, it is scarcely, if at all, touched by human hand. Machinery puts it in the earth. Machinery gathers, threshes, cleans, weighs, transports, and grinds its offspring. In large bread factories, the dough is mixed and conveyed to the oven by machinery, and very possibly the first occasion on which a finger touches it is its removal to the baker's cart for delivery to his customers. Returning to the railway in our last sentence, we may claim a great advantage over Joseph's brethren. When they needed corn, they were compelled to go to fetch it. When we need corn, it comes to us. Consequently, the human race as a whole is much better off now than it was in the time of pharaohs. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. Adventures on the Line. The Uganda Railway runs from the island of Mombasa on the east coast of Africa to Port Florence, 580 miles distant on the eastern shore of the Great Victoria Nyanza. In the 5 years following 1891, the surveyors were busy marking out the best route for the line which the British government built to open up trade between the central districts of the British East Africa Company and the Indian Ocean. A task by no means easy in a country infested by wild beasts, badly watered in parts, and beset with dense, prickly jungles, which presented a hedgehog-like front to the explorer. However, the survey came to its desired end, and in 1895 operations commenced at the eastern end. By 1897, railhead had reached a point over 100 miles from the coast named Tsavo. Lieutenant Colonel J. H. Patterson, D.S.O., was sent out in that year to take command of the army of Indian navvies who had their camp at the place mentioned, now a little wayside station. In 1898, the navvies suddenly became the quarry of a couple of fierce, man-eating lions, whose depredations spread such panic among the poor fellows that for a time work on the line was disorganized and actually suspended. Lord Salisbury, speaking in the House of Lords upon the progress of the Uganda Railway, said, The whole of the work was put a stop to for 3 weeks because a party of man-eating lions appeared in the locality and conceived a most unfortunate taste for our porters. At last, the laborers entirely declined to go on unless they were guarded by an iron entrenchment. Of course, it is difficult to work a railway under these conditions, and until we found an enthusiastic sportsman to get rid of these lions, our enterprise was seriously hindered. The sportsman in question was Lieutenant Colonel Patterson himself, who has, in the pages of the Wide World magazine, given a detailed account of the depredations of these savage beasts and the manner in which they were eventually brought to book. The story is so interesting and its authenticity so well established that a few pages may well be devoted to its more striking episodes. Scarcely had the coolies settled down at Tsavo when 1 or 2 of their number disappeared mysteriously. At first it was thought they had been done away with by their fellows or some prowling natives. News soon went round the camp, however, that a Sikh had been seized by a lion while sleeping with a number of companions in a tent, and carried off into the bush. After that, the tent doors were kept vigorously closed, and Colonel Patterson commenced his long and patient series of night watches for the enemy. His post was usually in a tree, whence night after night he could hear the roarings of the lions as they approached the encampment. As soon as their hunting began, they became perfectly silent, and presently there would be a shriek heard to prove that one more luckless coolie had gone to swell the total of victims. The lions displayed the greatest cunning, visiting different parts of the lines each night so that no one knew where to expect them. To track them into the bush would have been a very risky proceeding, and there appeared to be no remedy except to wait until chance should bring the brutes within rifle shot. Their success made the lions bolder. Of flames they recked nothing, and they bore off more than one man as he sat close to the blaze of the camp fire. Accordingly, the camp was surrounded with a boma, or artificial hedge of thorns. The lions leaped over it, and even invaded the hospital tents, killing 1 man and wounding 2 more on their first visit. It became necessary to remove the hospital to a position nearer headquarters. About this time, the main body of the coolies, numbering between 2,000 and 3,000 men, left Tsavo and migrated to the new railhead some miles away. The few hundreds left behind, feeling that their individual chances of proving the next victim had materially increased, grew more and more nervous. A cruel fate now overtook the water carrier of the hospital. The beastie, says Colonel Patterson, was lying on the floor of his tent with his head towards the middle and his feet touching the side. The lion put his head under the canvas, seized him by the foot, and dragged him out. The poor fellow in desperation clutched at a box which he dragged with him until it was stopped by the tent, and he was forced to let it go. He then caught a tent rope, which he held tightly until it broke. As soon as the lion got him clear, he sprang at the man's throat, and the poor water carrier's cries were silenced forever. The lion, not being able to leap the fence, ran up and down with his lifeless burden in his mouth, looking for a weak place to force his way through. This he presently found and plunged into, dragging his victim with him, leaving shreds of torn cloth on the thorns as evidences of his passage. Colonel Patterson at once had the hospital moved again, and, hoping that the man-eaters would try their luck a second time in the same spot, hid himself with Dr. Brock in a covered goods wagon on a railway siding close by. The top part of the doors was kept open, so that the watchers might have a chance of seeing what went on outside. Presently a twig cracked close by, and Colonel Patterson suggested that he should go out to reconnoiter. At his companion's advice, he remained inside, fortunately for him, as the lion was actually stalking the ambush. Presently a huge body sprang at us. "The lion!" I shouted, and we both fired almost simultaneously, and not a moment too soon, for before he could turn I felt his hot breath on my face. But the brute escaped with a whole skin, and though for a time he and his mate ceased their marauding, it was not very long before they had sufficiently recovered from their fright to take the field again with renewed activity. In a week 5 men were carried off and eaten. The chief therefore decided to construct a trap out of sleepers and rails and bait it with a few men. For the protection of the latter, the trap was divided into 2 parts, separated by a grid of rails. In its general principles, this device copied the catch-em-alive-o rat cage. Whether the lions suspected something wrong or not, at least they abandoned Tsavo for a few months, and when the coolies had grown used to their absence, returned, seized a man, and ate him within a few yards of his tent. On one occasion, while the chief was keeping his solitary guard, rifle in hand, he heard a purring noise, which told that the lions were having a meal close by. But the darkness made it useless to venture a shot. Waxing yet bolder, the lions now delivered a double attack, sprang over the boma, seized each a Swahili porter, and dragged him off through the thorn fence. This proved quite too much for the coolies' nerves. On December 1st, 1898, they all struck work and declared that Tsavo had become too dangerous for them. They had come from India on an agreement to work for the government, but not to supply food for devils. It must here be mentioned that these superstitious fellows regarded the lions as the embodied spirits of chiefs who had once ruled in the land now intersected by the railways, and thus wreaked vengeance on the intruders. Some hundreds of them were as good as their word, and swarmed onto the next passing train. Those who remained behind made themselves sleeping places in trees, on roofs, on girders, anywhere except on Mother Earth. Colonel Patterson, to whom the business of lying out had long grown wearisome and distasteful, summoned the district commissioner and as many soldiers as he could spare to take part in an organized hunt. Mr. Whitehead arrived at Tsavo after dusk, and while on his way to headquarters in company with a native sergeant, he was attacked by one of the brutes for which he had come to look. the report of his carbine saved him from anything worse than some severe scratches, but the lion, not wishing to go hungry away, grabbed the unfortunate sergeant and made a meal off him. Shortly afterwards, a lion investigated the trap and was caught. The coolies, anxious to be quits with their ancient enemy, fired so randomly through the bars at him that they managed to blow away part of the door, and he escaped again, much to the annoyance of everyone concerned. Luck was indeed on the side of the lions. A less keen sportsman than Colonel Patterson might well have despaired of ever getting even with the marauders. When at last he had a fair chance of finishing one of them off, the rifle, a borrowed one, missed fire and so confirmed the Indians in their belief that they had to deal with something more than mere lions. However, all comes to him who waits. One night the chief's rifle spoke to good effect, and next morning a man-eater was found dead, in the attitude of one about to spring. The natives could not restrain their delight. They beat tom-toms, blew horns, seized their deliverer, and carried him shoulder-high round and round the spoil, which measured 9 feet 8 inches from tip to tip, and stood 45 inches at the shoulder. The other lion, in spite of its loss, maintained a formidable reputation, but his end also was not far off. As the result of a midnight feast on goats, he received the contents of a double-barreled smooth-bore, which for 10 days or so put him out of action. Then he resumed his old tactics, killing goats where he could not get men. One bright moonlit night the colonel was at his usual post in a tree when he saw the lion sneaking from bush to bush, taking advantage of every patch of cover in a most skillful manner. A bullet fired at close quarters struck the brute on the chest, and he bounded off into the woods, his retreat hastened by 3 additional shots, one of which also took effect. At dawn, trackers got to work, and, guided by blood marks, they soon came upon their quarry in among some bushes. Patterson fired at his head. The lion charged, to receive another bullet in his hind legs. A third bullet apparently killed him, for he turned over and lay quite still. But there was enough life left in him for another rush, during which his evil career terminated. The workmen, burning with recollections of murdered messmates, could hardly be restrained from tearing to pieces after death the monster whom in his life they had so much feared. As soon as the news of the second devil's death was spread about, many coolies returned to the camp, whence they had been driven by their dread of the man-eaters. It must be said of the Indians that, if not over-brave men, they were at least appreciative, for they clubbed together and bought their deliverer a fine silver bull, on which was engraved a Hindustani poem setting forth his prowess, trials, and final triumph. This bull is now to be seen in the Norwich Museum, flanked by the heads of the 2 prowlers that once made life so exciting in Saville. Some time after the death of the second lion, Colonel Patterson stumbled on the den in which the pair lived. It was a dark and fearsome cave, running under some enormous rocks, with a great tree growing near its entrance. It extended a good way back, and I did not feel inclined to explore it. The smell of the place was terrible. There were human bones lying about, and also some copper bangles, such as the native of Africa loves to wear. This is the story of the man-eaters who were responsible for the death of 28 Indian coolies and an indefinite number of African natives. It was indeed fortunate for the progress of the line that the bad example set by the Tsavo lions did not encourage others to imitation, and we may speculate on the outcome of a determined resistance by the brute creation to the advance of the engineer, as in this case human cunning would, no doubt, have ultimately proved more than a match for that of the king of the beasts, but not until a terrible toll had been taken of the human invaders. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of the Romance of Modern Locomotion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claudia Caldi. The Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams. Ocean Ferries. One day, in the year 1800, the Admiralty Board assembled to discuss a memorial address to them by a Mr. Henry Bell. It asked, "My Lord," to seriously consider the practicability and utility of steam as a marine propelling power against winds and tides and every obstruction in rivers and seas where there was a depth of water. The gentleman in question turned a deaf ear to the claims put forward by the father of steam navigation in favor of the motive force that was so soon to revolutionize locomotion of both land and sea. All except England's greatest sailor, who, with a broad-mindedness and sagacity that did him honor, rose and said, "My lords and gentlemen, if you do not adopt Mr. Bell's scheme, other nations will, and in the end vex every vein of this empire." These were indeed extraordinary words from the mouth of a man who had won fame by his handling of the sail-driven wooden walls of old England. Well would it have been for his country had future admirals showed as liberal a spirit in their criticism of new inventions. But even he must have only very dimly foreseen the day when huge armor-clad floating forts should cut through the ocean at a speed compared with which the performances of his swiftest frigates were but a crawl. Mighty as have been the influences of steam on the development of naval warfare, yet more wonderful must we consider the impetus given by it to the extension of trade and intercourse between nations. It is impossible today to realize the slowness and uncertainty of a passage between the far sundered parts of the world, when men relied on the humours of the winds, and a journey to Australia might occupy 6 months or a year according to the condition of the elements. Now the steamship runs on time with the punctuality of an express train and enables the traveller to circle the world without any vexatious delays. The intimate nature of the connection between the railway and the steamship is too obvious to require any elaboration. The boat train and the mail, which will passengers and postal matter to our great ports, are our crack expresses. But they form but a part, and that not a very large one, of the great system whereby land and marine transport mutually feed and sustain one another. It is the cargo-carrying capacity of a ship that, as a general rule, renders its travels profitable to the owners. The splendid accommodation made for the comfort of passengers attracts the eye, but the gentleman that pays the rent has been carefully stowed by the 1,000 tons in the bowels of the mighty ship before the human load is taken aboard. When the latter has landed and dispersed its several ways, the hatches are opened and mountains of merchandise soon accumulate on the quays and in the great warehouses that form so prominent a feature of a seaport. and long after the express has started on its course for the metropolis, the contents of the lines are transferred to the slower goods train for distribution. This process generally escapes the eye of the globe-trotter, but it forms the lifeblood of commerce. It is interesting to note that the successes of George Stephenson on the railway gave a great impulse to steam navigation. The first steamboat was that of John Fitch, who in 1787 propelled a boat on the Delaware River with paddles driven by steam. The pressure used in this and many subsequent boats was very low. Even as late as 1840, the Cunard Britannia, of 2,050 tons displacement, was run with about 12 pounds showing on the steam gauge. Stevenson, however, advocated much higher stresses, and the figures gradually rose till 1869, when the Inman liner, the City of Paris, carried boilers which raised 30 pounds. During the next 2 years, a great advance was made to 65 pounds, and the era of compound engines on steamboats began. By 1886, a pressure of 150 pounds to the square inch caused the introduction of triple expansion engines, and since then a further increase to 220 pounds has enabled the engineer to use quadruply expanded steam. It is indeed amusing to contrast the powerful boilers of today with those of the Britannia, which were so gentle that when on one occasion a steam pipe burst, the engineers lapped it with canvas and rope yarn. The story of the steamship is so full of such contrasts that we may briefly notice the main incidents which inaugurated the important periods of construction. The year 1843 deserves our special attention, since it saw the first employment of iron in a large ocean-going steamer, the Great Britain, built under the superintendence of Brunel the Younger. This ship is also remarkable from the fact that it differed from previously constructed liners in the substitution of a screw for the usual paddle wheels as the propelling power. The innovation at first caused some alarm among the men who tended the engines, since the number of revolutions per minute, which for paddles stood at 14 to 18, suddenly increased to 40 to 90, and it was feared that the machinery must fly to pieces under the strain. People watched with interest the performances of competing paddle and screw ships. For some time victory lay with the former, but gradually the screw ousted its rival. In 1891, the first twin-screw vessel, the Notting Hill, appeared. Since that date, few liners have been constructed to carry but a single propeller. Iron is no longer used for shipbuilding. Steel has taken its place as being tougher and stiffer weight for weight. But since even the stoutest metal cannot withstand the effects of a collision, security against sinking is further secured through the division of a vessel into a number of departments by a system of bulkheads. When the exterior walls of such a compartment have been breached, a danger signal is given, and in a few seconds the doors in the bulkheads are closed, shutting off each compartment from its neighbors, so that even if one or more are filled, the vessel will still have sufficient buoyancy to enable her to progress without risk. Speed. As in the case of the railway, the increase of speed is one standard by which the progress of ocean travel must be judged. Disregarding the earliest experiments, we will commence comparisons in 1840, when the Britannic averaged 8 1/4 knots between England and America. A decade later, the Arctic averaged 11 3/4, and in 1858, the Great Eastern 13. The compound Oceanic reached 14 3/4 in 1871, and the Britannic 16 in 1874. 20 knots an hour were first covered by the City of Paris, 1889. During the years 1901-1903, records were frequently broken. In June 1901, the Deutschland averaged 23.51 knots between New York and Plymouth, which represents 27 miles an hour, or a considerably faster speed than that of the Calcutta-Bombay expresses. The following year, the Kronprinz Wilhelm managed to attain a mean of 23.37 knots over the same route. On the westward trip, the former vessel also secured first place by a 23.15 knot voyage in September 1903. So that, for the present, the German liners have held the palm easily, the best English record being that of the Lucania, 22.01 knots. The Cunard Company expect, however, to bring the record back to England when their new flyers get to work. This company has received assistance from the government in the shape of a sum of £2,600,000 advanced for the building of 2 huge vessels, which shall have a minimum speed of 24.5 knots an hour in moderate weather, so exceeding the finest efforts of the German greyhounds by a full knot. The money will be advanced in installments as the work proceeds and must be repaid in 20 years' time. To propel these ships, which will measure 770 to 780 feet from stern to stern at the contract speed, engines of 55,000 horsepower will be needed. They will therefore take first place at once for size, speed, and power. Apart from these considerations, they are of particular interest, since in them the turbine will replace the ordinary reciprocating engines. A committee of experts, who were appointed to decide the knotty point of turbine or rotary, recommended that the new steamers should be propelled by turbine engines, and the Cunard Directorate, with their usual enterprise, have agreed to the employment of turbines. It is only 9 years or so since the Turbinia, of 44.5 tons displacement, astonished the world by attaining a speed of 34.5 knots, 39.7 miles per hour. Subsequently, the ill-fated Viper and Cobra torpedo destroyers were built and covered 41 miles in an hour. The turbine was then applied to the Clyde passenger steamers King Edward and Queen Alexandra, to the Queen for the Dover-Calais route, and the Brighton for the New Haven-Dieppe passage. These can all attain about 20 knots and have proved very seaworthy and free from vibration. While cross-channel and coastwise turbine steamers are becoming quite common, the Allen Line has launched a transatlantic turbine vessel, the Victorian, of 12,000 tons for mail, passenger and cargo traffic between Liverpool and Canadian ports. She, like the future Cunarders, will be the largest as well as the fastest of the fleet. She is fitted in the modern style for upwards of 1,500 passengers, and it is expected that the absence of the throbbing movement, inseparable from even the best balanced reciprocating engine, will make her at once noiseless and particularly steady in a heavy seaway. A special arrangement has been devised by the Honourable A. C. Parsons, the patentee of the marine turbine, whereby a reversing power equal to that of the forward propelling power can be imparted to the machinery, securing almost instant arrest of the ship's forward motion and very speedy backing in case of need. Hitherto, the reversing of a turbine-driven vessel has been accomplished only by the use of special turbines, giving the turbine in this respect an inferiority to the ordinary type of engine. To the engineer, the adoption of rotary engines means increased speed for the same boiler power, due to reduced weight of machinery and increased economy in steam. The cost of upkeep is also less, while there is a smaller engine room staff and a diminished bill for the lubricants. To the passenger, it means a complete freedom from vibration and consequently much greater comfort. In short, the mere fact that the Cunard Directorate have adopted on the best expert advised steam turbine is proof positive that the rotary engine is the marine engine of the future, and its adoption will mark the commencement of a new era in navigation. The largest and in many respects the finest vessel afloat is the White Star liner Baltic, which has recently been launched from the yards of Messrs. Harland and Wolff of Belfast. This Leviathan is 725 feet long, 75 feet broad, and 49 feet deep. Her gross tonnage figures at nearly 24,000, and at the load line she displaces about 48,000 tons, 28,000 of which are represented by cargo. The luxurious accommodation of the Atlantic liners is proverbial and need not be mentioned here, but we may note that on the Baltic and her sister ships, the Cedric and Celtic, the passenger is much less liable to mal de mer than he or she is on smaller vessels. A striking proof of the steadiness of these monsters is afforded by the statement of the Cedric's surgeon to the effect that during her maiden voyage not a single passenger was seasick, and that a wine-glass, brimming full, placed on the edge of a sideboard, neither moved from its original position nor lost a single drop. This marvellous steadiness is not due to size only, since the Great Eastern, in spite of her enormous tonnage, was a villainous sea-boat, and a very purgatory to passengers with delicate stomachs. Since she was built, designers have mastered the laws which govern the stability of a vessel in heavy weather. While the fastest times are made between England and America, corresponding improvement has taken place in the times occupied on other routes. The mails are now carried regularly to and from Bombay in 14.5 days, the record time being 12.5 days by the Caledonia in 1893. A passenger may reach Shanghai in 33 days, Hong Kong in 24, Adelaide in 30.25, Cape Town in 15. The cost of travel has also been greatly reduced since Charles Dickens made his memorable voyage to the United States. At present, an emigrant may cross from Liverpool to New York for a little over £2, which in 5 days or more will transport him 3,000 miles, while feeding him on much better food than he is probably accustomed to at home. This cheapness is due largely to the competition between rival lines, and cannot therefore be expected to last indefinitely. But even were prices to return to the level of a few years ago, they would still be remarkably reasonable. The latest thing in ocean travel is wireless telegraphy, which robs the liner of any inconvenience arising from separation from the outer world. The Cunard was the first steamship company to systematically employ this latest development of electrical science. In the Lucania, Mr. Marconi's system was first permanently set up, and the passengers had the opportunity of witnessing the earliest experiment in the successful maintenance of communication between the ship and the shore. So pleased were the directors with the results then achieved, that they at once decided to adopt the invention in their other vessels, and it is now in regular operation in a number of their fastest liners. A small staff publishes a ship's newspaper daily, in which are recorded important events flashed from America or Cornwall, together with the prices ruling on change, so that the businessman may know what to expect when he lands. By means of aerial telegraphy, a ship is able to keep in touch with another far over the horizon and call it to help in case of accident or danger. It is no small comfort to the well-housed, well-fed passenger to know that, thanks to the wireless message, he is so near to, though so far from, his fellows. End of the Romance of Modern Locomotion by Archibald Williams.